to 45 seconds because YouTube sucks.
It is what it is.
There's still a lag here from StreamYard to YouTube.
Such is the way with it.
Okay. All right, let me do the sound check and then we'll get started. So, can anybody in the audience hear me? The sound okay? Audio.
Do we sound horrifically bad?
That's the question. And I know there's one that says there's okay. It says we're okay.
Good.
All right. So the last time I talked to you directly was on the socialism stream, and I think we got up to collectivization of agriculture in the early 1930s and dekulakization, which is really, I guess, the beginning of what we could call the Stalin regime after the removal of the left and right opposition from power in the Politburo, particularly Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Trotsky on the left, and then particularly Bukharin on the right. And then the assault on the parallel society of the peasantry, I guess the kulaks.
Indeed, the Bukharin thing is, I think that's the real turning point. You know, Stalin is let's say curating quite a bit before then, but at the time that he just kind of stomps Bukharin, things change pretty dramatically and very quickly.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, Bukharin had the silly idea, I think, that you could peacefully industrialize the Soviet Union by leveraging the difference in the cost the state paid for grain from the countryside and industrial goods. So if they bought cheap grain from the countryside, exported it for a markup, and then sold industrial goods at high prices to the countryside, they could use this difference to industrialize. But of course, without the massive coercion, why would any grain farmer go along with this plan?
And yes, I mean that this is one of the things where I start to disagree with people very heavily, and I know I stand as like just ahistorical as hell here, but this, you know, that there was a right deviation. Yeah, like within the confines of communism, there was a right deviation, because it was still, well, what we're going to do is we're going to plan economy, but we're going to do it with incentives more than just direct and overt force. And that was the right deviation. And apparently, per Stalin, that was unacceptable.
Yes, because what happens, as we know, is that both politically and economically, the kulaks, as they were called, managed to reject this plan. There was no point in selling cheap grain to the cities rather than making it into a moonshine, a samogan in Russian, and buying expensive goods. So you had actually here your successful economic parallelism, and even in the local level political, but without any positions in the OGPU or the Politburo or institutions that really mattered. They were basically sitting ducks for a massive Wacoing.
I mean, that is what happened. So it's interesting because if you watch the other side of this, right, there was and I forget the name of them because I'm always bad with names, but there was a political movement that was of the opinion that specifically the Ukraine was kind of going to break off and it was just going to do its own thing, and the cities could have their stupid communism. It didn't have any actual power. It was just a bunch of people who just said, well, we're just going to do this. And that went about as well as you'd expect when the Red Army got involved.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a way, it's almost inevitable that the position, although the people are gone, of the left opposition, basically Trotsky's idea that you have to militarize the economy, basically reinsert the agricultural population.
Yeah.
Is the only way to build this alternative to capitalism. Otherwise, the capitalist relations are going to reassert themselves from the bottom up.
Yeah. There's some interesting debate stuff that happens around this where everyone involved, Trotsky, Bukharin, Stalin, everybody that enters this conversation at one point or another doesn't want to do this heavy militarization, and then at a different point definitely does. Right? And then they vacillate between the two of them. Certainly I don't know what they were all thinking at any individual moment, but it seems a lot more like it's a political discussion of what is politically advantageous at the moment, as opposed to whether or not this is truly the right course. Because there are times in Central Committee discussions where Trotsky will propose something effectively on a Monday. Everyone will oppose it. And on the next Friday, Stalin is proposing the same thing. And about a third of those people are still opposing it, but everybody else is suddenly on board.
Yes. I mean, in a real sense, the conflict is not so much over policy as over these personal factions. So,
yeah,
Stalin uses his position as the Secretary General and the head of the Org Bureau to basically appoint Central Committee to be in his favor against both what is called the right opposition. Usually we're talking Bukharin, these people, mostly ethnic Russians, but I don't think that's as important an issue. And then the left opposition, usually talking about people around Trotsky, most of them ethnic Jews. But again, probably not as important as just the fact that you have these personalities, Trotsky, Kamenev, and Zinoviev, and then Bukharin on the other side. And then you have the Stalin, who is neither Russian or Jewish, who's Georgian,
right.
who is a much better politician than any of them, and able to successfully remove all of them. And remove them ultimately from the planet. Kamenev, Zinoviev, Bukharin are all tried and executed, and Trotsky is hunted down in Mexico and assassinated.
There's an interesting thing with that too, because specifically with Bukharin, I think Stalin has got him like scheduled and ready to go to the gulag, sometimes for life. And he just hands him down a pardon for seemingly no reason. Just, you know what? It was a mistake. People make them. No, you don't get to have political power, but just go over there. And we're not, he sort of exiles him out of, the capital city, which name I, for some reason, am forgetting.
Moscow?
Yeah, he kicks him out of Moscow a bunch of times. And then Bukharin sort of comes back-ish. And then a few weeks later, more than once, is you have turned against the party. You are doing, counter-revolutionary activities. We are going to send you the gulag for 10, 20, 30 years. And then right, he has his trial, which is the trial you would expect it to be. It's a show trial. Everything is set and ready to go. There's a lot of pack up your stuff. You were a party official, so we're going to give you 2 days. And on the second day, Stalin issues a decree that says he doesn't go to the Gulag, just out of nowhere.
The argument is that until 1934, with the assassination of Kirill, that the legal infrastructure to properly conduct a physical purge of the party with bullets is not in place. So this takes a few years before the actual Great Terror begins. The Great Purge probably begins in 36 with the show trials, and then the mass arrests and executions really in 37, particularly starting in July. But you have everything is put in place in 1934 after Kirov is assassinated in a shooting that makes the Kennedy assassination look very clear and very, very understandable and in its details. So lots of murky stuff going around. How did this former party member get into the head of the headquarters of the Communist Party of Leningrad with a gun and shoot the head of the Leningrad organization? And then is instantly arrested, interrogated, and executed before any more information can come out.
Yeah, and he sits down according to official party reports, he just sits down in the room and then cries or something like that. And when they pick him up, his answer is something like, "Well, I was just having a bad day," And oh God, I forget the guy's name because, as usual, I'm bad with names, that assassinated him. But he was
Nikolaev.
Yeah, yes, and he was in his ascendancy in the party a couple of months before, right? And this is sort of the excuse that you get from a lot of historians on the subject is, well, the guards just didn't know he had been exiled from the party. And I've heard that and thought, that's amazing, because they turned on a dime on every other expulsion from the party. And this guy walks
to get into those headquarters, you needed to have a permit, and to be carrying that gun, you needed to have a permit, and he didn't have either.
Exactly. And there's this the guards at the front gates demand that they don't know who let him in. And when you say it makes the Kennedy assassination look very clear, it is hard to comprehend how true that is, because this is like roughly the equivalent of some random guy who once had a political career assassinating Joe Biden in the Oval Office, and just everybody going, we don't really know what happens. And his answer just being like, well, I was just having a bad day.
Except we do know that as soon as it happened, Stalin gave orders to make the mass arrest and trials by these troikas and executions very streamlined. That anything that might be kind of an obstacle, which kind of maybe an illusion of due process, was quickly eliminated from the Soviet legal system immediately after Kirov's assassination. So if we look at who benefits, right, there's a lot of a speculation. Well, this is awfully convenient to have a popular head of the second largest city in the Soviet Union's Communist Party be assassinated by an enemy, and to allow for legal changes that make mass arrests and executions very easy a couple years later.
It's in a term that I don't think was really even invented at the time. It smells much more like false flag than it does assassination, for sure. But it's one of those things that I look at and I go, who believed this? Right? Because I'm fairly certain everyone in the Soviet Union knew that you don't just walk into the party headquarters, right? And that leaves the gun issue aside. Is you just random guy effectively at this point, who,
but not random guy.
right?
He was expelled for disciplinary reasons, so he's on the blacklist.
Well, indeed, but I don't imagine, because he was some like undersecretary's undersecretary, if I remember correctly, and I forget exactly what position he held, but it's sort of like in the U.S. is who is the Secretary of Defense's top aide, right? Does anyone know the answer to that question? I mean, I'm sure the Secretary of Defense does, but does anybody else? And he had that kind of position. So if you went back to the Soviet Union, you were like, so this guy that you've never heard of, he totally just walked into the party headquarters. Like, just some random guy walked into the party headquarters? Seriously?
Yeah, it would be like some nameless Pentagon official walking in after he had been fired,
Right.
and shooting the Secretary of Defense. How did he get back in the building, and how did he get back in there with a gun, and how is it that he got to the secretary and managed to shoot him, and then instantly he's arrested, and then the next day shot, and we're left with very little in the way of answers, right? So
yeah, it's the kind of thing, though, that when people talk about in the modern era, they say things like, well, that sort of thing will never happen. Go back and read this, right? It's not, this story in particular is always included in some other massive review of the Soviet Union. There's not like, there should be a book unto itself about this.
There is at least one. Amy Knight, who used to work for the Library of Congress, I believe, has written a book on the Kirov assassination. I believe Robert Conquest also wrote one before he died in his 90s a few years back. So I think there's a couple. So Conquest and Knight, I believe, both have written specifically on the assassination of Kirov.
I will have to go read those, because everything else, every other time that I encounter this, it's in
Let me see if I can.
the history of the Soviet Union, or the biography of Stalin, or something wild, and it seems like a lot of these people do go into pretty big detail about it. But
20 years ago, we have Amy Knight's book, 2000, Who Killed Kirov? I'll put that in the chat. And let me see. I'm less sure about Conquest, but I think he did. Conquest wrote so much, it's hard to keep track of it all.
Well, that's a fact. Oh wow, this is like $12. I'm definitely gonna read this.
Yeah, I remember reading that. So that one's a bit old, but it's at least after the opening, partially. Obviously, most of the archives, including the FSB archives, were never opened. But yes, so there is a Conquest book. There's one left in stock at Amazon. So when was this written? Stalin and the Kirov murder. It's a short book. It's only 164 pages. And it came out in 1989, so before the opening of the archives. But Conquest does very well with very little information sometimes. So
indeed,
it's a short book. That's the other one. So Knight and Conquest both have specific books on Kirov assassination.
See that? I don't know. I'm a little less interested, because the archives had so much that took a lot of speculation out of so many things. And don't get me wrong, there's still, there's stuff that my grandkids will see released from those archives if we're lucky. But in the meantime, even some things that didn't have a lot of information, mostly were official documents published by the Central Committee on a subject, are very telling compared to what external propaganda to the rest of the world was.
Yeah, well, Knight book would have been written during the time when he had the greatest access to archives out of Moscow. So right now, the place that has the freest access for Stalin era archives is Kiev in Ukraine.
It's the kind of thing that almost makes you want to read Russian and, learn to read Russian if you're me, and not you, who already does. And then just go fly over there and start translating as fast as possible.
It's actually not that easy. But I've the easiest thing actually, as far as archives, if you know somebody who used to work in the archives and still has access to them, if they will do the legwork for you for money because they can get access to stuff lots faster and easier. So that's the way I got most of the stuff I have from Moscow. I've been in some Soviet archives in person and been in Tartu and Bishkek. But if you're if you're a former employee of the archives itself, it's so much easier.
Yeah, that's again, because I talk about him all the time. Kotkin has a talk on YouTube about exactly this sort of thing, and he says, if you really want to study these archives and you don't have somebody to help you, what you need to do is live in the city, because they do stuff like only open the archives every other week. And you can only be there for 2 hours, and they don't tell you what day it is until the day before, and on and on and on. The games are still being played very clearly.
Yeah, well, that also depends on which archives. So if you go to the archives in the Baltic states, I've been to they moved the ones in Estonia from Tallinn to Tartu.
Yeah,
they're generally very helpful to you because if anything you want to do that's anti-Soviet, they're all for.
Oh yeah.
In Central Asia, it's less so because they don't have nearly as negative memory of the Soviet era as the Baltic people. So it varies from place to place. But
Kotkin, I think Kotkin's talking Moscow.
Well, Moscow is the big archive is the state archives of the Russian Federation, and then there's the Russian state archives of social and political history. Those are the two that I used in my book that I now have a contract for out of an academic publisher in Europe. So I guess they sent. I'm waiting for the contract. They said they sent it by post, but if it doesn't arrive soon, I'm just going to tell them email it to me, and I'll print it out, sign it, and scan it back in because they did admit in the email they've had difficulty mailing stuff to the U.S. Physically recently. Yeah, I don't know why.
If only we had some clue. Anyway, before we get too horrendously distracted with learning about, or how you get around to learning about, because I get the feeling we will, because that unto itself is an interesting discussion, how much of a pain it is. What are we coming up on a century later to even figure out some of what they were thinking and talking at the, at the time?
Well, it depends where you want to start, but yeah, certainly. If we, I guess, we were kind of starting. I kind of start the Stalin era in 28. So this is at the beginning of collectivization and the first 5-year plan, which is only 4 years because they completed early, and the removal of the left and right oppositions from the Politburo, although they're still alive for a few years.
Yeah. It's not an unreasonable time to start. I mean, I have caught a lot of pedantry reading about this. So, Stalin was actually in control from. I mean, there are some people who think Stalin was in control since like 1907, and that seems pretty ridiculous to me, right? That's giving a lot of credit to Stalin when Lenin was clearly running everything. But you get, I don't know, you get some argument about Wow right before Lenin gets sick and that sort of thing. But 28 sounds about right.
And then, of course, he dies in 5th of March, 1953. So after
It
that,
ends there.
yeah, well, Stalin himself is gone, and then his closest associates are removed from the Politburo, but they live for a long time. Molotov and Kaganovich hang about
Yeah.
almost to the end of the Soviet Union itself.
Yeah. Is it Molotov dies like within a year or two before the Soviet Union ends?
Let's look it up. Yeah, I think
89
he
or something
dies
like that?
like the year before Kaganovich. Kaganovich lived to 98, so
Yeah. There.
Molotov. Molotov dies in 1986, so the year before Perestroika, and he is 96 years old. So,
Yeah.
but Kaganovich was born a little bit later and lived to be 98. So he actually makes it almost to the end of the Soviet Union.
Must be Kaganovich that I'm thinking of then, because
I think
there's one
Kaganovich
of
dies in
them.
like 1990.
Yeah, there's one of them that that lives until
Kaganovich dies in 91.
yeah.
So he's just a few months before the Soviet Union ends. He
Yeah.
dies in July.
So I mean that's, if you're familiar at all with things like life expectancy in the Soviet Union, that's incredible. But
Oh, well, these aren't peasants, though. These are former Politburo members.
It does help, right? You actually do get medical care ever.
So I guess the Kirov assassination can lead us to the next big thing after collectivization, which would be or I guess we could start with. Did you want to? I gave you one piece on Kulaks by Lynn Viola, which is kind of a short piece rather than her book. Would you have anything to add on that?
So, not real. I mean, I think it's most of the stuff that we've generally covered before, at least in premise. Other than there are a lot of raw numbers in here that some of which I've never seen before. The numbers of people they're talking about moving around are massive.
Yes.
And you usually hear these numbers in abstract numbers. The tens of thousands of people, which could mean anything. And like right now, I've got the little chart up for regional origins of specialist settlers in the North, 1930, and that's 230,000 people they're talking about moving around. That's a city.
Yeah, the archives are full of these statistics, but you need to take them with a grain of salt because a lot of these guys compiling these things aren't real good at counting or adding
or typing, apparently, because it's the first one that I was reading through was the persecution of ethnic Germans, and
that's mine.
And so somewhere in there you're talking about how they are going through all of these records of people moving, or they're trying to really get good numbers on it, and the guy put in charge of it mistypes 900 and it's like 917,000 is 947,000.
Yeah, they lose tens of thousands of people through such errors,
and just all the time. And there's every single one of these that we went over, or that you sent me, has a ton of When people departed here, they counted them as 400,000, and when they got to wherever they were going, it was actually 320,000, and somewhere along the way they counted them and found out and decided it was 480,000, and so I don't know, it was probably somewhere around 400,000.
Yeah, that's well, but of course, one of the things that's kind of hidden there, right? They don't have X number of people died en route. Right? Let's say we sent, a good example is the original dekulakization. So 1.8 million people are sent in exile internally in 1930 and 1931. And so they do the first recount in 1932, and it's 1.3 million. So there's 500,000 people missing. But I mean, the subtext of that is a lot of those 500,000 people are dead.
Yeah. There's some other stuff, and I forget which one it's in, but it's talking about basically every time the Soviets moved somebody, moved large groups of people, not like one person kind of somebody, but anytime they moved, say 10,000 or more seems to be about the number. What they would do is go, well, you're going to move over here and you're going to stay here. And then they would come back through and find like all of the houses empty that they put these people in and went, where the hell did they go? Right now, I mean, that puts on the table not just that these people died, because I'm sure the Soviets didn't really care if lots of those people died, but also that, if you pick somebody up and you move them a distance they could reasonably travel back home, and you just say you have to stay here, some portion of them are just going to pack their stuff and leave.
That happens a lot. So in 1930 to 1934, there's a lot of people who are deported as kulaks who flee because they don't want to starve to death in the exile villages. So they go to Leningrad or Moscow and attempt to get jobs as basically undocumented workers within their own state. And so there's a lot of them. We don't know how many of them versus how many die. But we do know that in 1934, it's enough to reorganize the entire political police. OGPU becomes the NKVD, and Yagoda becomes the head. And the number of recorded escapes, the numbers are putting down in the document, greatly decreases. So they start recording escapes in 32, and they're very high in 32 and 33 during the famine eras, and then they drop precipitously with reorganization in 34.
Is
and
this
then in
the
37 and 38, there's the... go ahead.
Is this the, I think it's 20, basically it's 26.9 or something like that, percent of the people they move are recorded as escapes, and it's like 5 or 10 years later, it's 14% or something like that.
Yes, it goes
12,
way down. Yeah.
Like it's less than in half.
Yeah. And then 37 and 38, there's a Kulak operation where basically the largest number of people rounded up and shot during these 2 years are escaped Kulaks that made it to the city. So the escape was only temporary.
There's a thing I think that is worth talking about. We're sort of skipping over here, which is a bunch of these times where they move, and I forget which document it is because I'm terrible, even though there's only 3. But one of them is going into detail about where they're moving them and how they're doing it. And it doesn't talk about it explicitly in the sense that I'm thinking, but they move a bunch of doctors and lawyers and very...
That would be my document. Yeah, the all of the urban population in the Volga German ASSR from Engels, the capital city, are moved to these remote farms in Krasnoyarsk Krai, and of course these people have never been on a farm before.
Right, and it's not just that though. When they get there, even the guys, the administration who bring them, right? Whatever administrative bureaucrats are like, so this farm thing, we're trying to do this in swamps and hard frozen soil. And look, even, for the first year, we're not going to get anything out of this, even if these people are any good. And it speaks to this thing that is the really malicious nature of communism, because well, maybe malicious is the wrong word, but its execution
Learn to
is
farm
pretty
instead of
malicious.
learn to code. Learn to farm.
Exactly. But on top of that is this thing that everything is equal, right? Because this equality goal, like, well, we could just move you to anywhere and you'll be able to farm. Well, it turns out that you can't really farm in a swamp, that you can't really farm in frozen soil. And at least as importantly, that a guy who's been a doctor for 20 years probably also not a great farmer.
Yeah. That certainly happens a lot. But this is, I guess, the speaks to the fact that Soviet policy was largely driven by political, not economic concerns.
Oh yeah.
So the reason for collectivization, the reason for the labor camps, the reason for uh, special settlement was not to uh, increase productivity. It was for political rather than economic concerns. Otherwise, we know that even in the Soviet Union, as horribly inefficient as it was, that their wage labor, uh, I guess so-called free labor, was much more productive per person than the forced labor.
Oh yeah. But there is an interesting thing in this, because you can see some talks about this every now and again come out of well, they don't so much come out, but they're had within the Politburo and within the Central Committee specifically, um, where they talk about, well, the Kulaks down here are doing all of this great stuff, but um, we need to make them communists, and we need to turn them into collective farms, or turn their farms into collective farms. And they, as often as not, the handful of times that they even address economic concerns, basically go straight Marx about it. Well, just imagine what would happen if we could get rid of profit. It's the only thing they ever say to it, and it's hard to tell whether or not that is out of the like forcible expression of true belief, or if it was just such a pervasive belief that they didn't think they needed to talk about it any. Like, if I walk outside tomorrow, I won't fly off into space because gravity exists. No one feels the need to say this, but we all know it. So it's very.
I think having lived in the former Soviet Union for a few years, that you get it affects the framing and the language. So even people who were not true believers, right? They didn't have a way to express any ideas other than this kind of Marxist-Leninist ideological framework that was the official
Party line.
discourse, right? So this is where you get some weird things in the '90s, particularly where you get, for instance, the Chechen jihadis basically speaking like Che Guevara, using Marxist-Leninist terminology.
Yeah. And the because of course no one could really have conversations with these people at the time, even whomever was permitted to interview Stalin, the 3 times that happened, you don't get to have a real conversation with the guy. It's hard to tell if they still thought they were revolutionaries at this point, or if this was just now so much the norm that, like, well, if we collectivize the thing, of course it's just going to work out. And the only hints I ever see to it are, when Stalin makes his speech about it. Are we communists or not? And even that is just, that's a moral courage cry. It's not It's not an economic argument, right?
Yeah, certainly there's a lot of talk about economic details when we talk about things like the special settlers or
Yeah,
inmates in the gulag, but there's never any justification put out that this is the most effective way to economically develop. It's always these people are counter-revolutionaries and need to be punished. And
yeah,
while we're punishing them, we need to reform them through labor because honest labor is, a matter of honor and glory. That's what it
yeah,
says on the gates of Vorkuta, the Soviet labor camp in the Arctic Circle where they mined coal. So there's this fetishization of physical labor as a way of transforming men's souls,
yeah.
right? But it doesn't seem to be really connected with, well, are they producing anything that's worthwhile? Or
No.
you have people like building canals that can't be used from the White Sea to the Baltic.
Yeah, it's always because I think it's your paper has some good information about after the decision is made, after people are moving, all of the sudden there's this talk about economic prosperity is coming, right? And it's in that order, which makes it a post hoc rationalization, right? Decisions already made, we already know what we're doing. See, now we're going to be successful because we are doing the thing that we know that we're doing. And that seems to be the only way that they talk about economic concerns almost at all.
There's some others, but a lot of it is technical. It's budgetary.
Right.
Um, it's a lot of it is, of course, they do not have the means to keep all of these people alive, right? It is known from the very beginning that a significant minority will die of material deprivation because things like food and housing and clothes just do not exist in large enough numbers where they are
Yeah.
sending them. And there is no way to get them in large enough numbers fast enough to prevent large numbers of them from dying.
Yeah, I think is it you that's talking about they move a bunch of people to a city and then immediately go, oh, there's a housing shortage. Wonder why is basically the way that it's sort of framed there is like, well, there's numbers made up off the top of my head. Well, there's 100,000 houses in this area. I wonder what'll happen if we just move 120,000 families there.
Yeah, well, they had instructions that the local authorities were to provide resources to build the housing, but
Yeah.
the local authorities did not have wood, glass, or nails. So how these houses were to be built is left as an unsolved economic problem here.
Yeah. Well, and this is this goes to the people like to get mad at me, specifically communists, when I say things like, well, you guys just act like everything is post scarcity and just as soon as you have a will to do something, it'll just happen. But that is the history of communism, is just, well, if we go down to the local bureau and we tell them you need to build houses for these people, then it will just happen because something we're post scarcity and it goes unsaid, right? No one comes out loud and says well, it doesn't matter that we need to find the materials. We don't, we think that everything is infinite. No one ever actually says that. It's just,
Well, in the
all of
archives,
their
there's all
actions.
kinds of letters, where there's an instruction to local authority: you need to build houses for these people, or we can't use them for labor because they'll all die of hypothermia. And the locals write back, well, we have no wood, we have no glass, we have no nails, and the nearest supply of wood is hundreds of kilometers away, and they're not giving us any. So what should we do, right? And then they writes back, well, the first thing is make sure none of these people engage in fascist agitation, right? That's like more important. Number two,
Yeah.
try and keep them alive so we can use them as labor. But if they die, well, make sure they're not engaged in fascist agitation.
Right. the concerns of these people are always, and what's funny about that is you don't see quite as much of it at the top. Like there's shrugs to it, but there seems to be an understanding once you get to central committee meetings that fascist agitation is just bad, and so if somebody wants to do something to stop that, that must be good. And the few times that I've seen things where they talk about it, they just shrug and yeah, stop the fascist agitation. Equally speaking with capitalism is, oh yeah, stop the capitalists, just do that. And then they kind of turn loose the machine that is the government of the Soviet Union, and you see a lot of middle management actually do a lot of the really brutal things because fascist agitation bad. So whatever it is that you have to do that.
So one of the main characters in the book I've just written is a guy named Ivanov. So it's basically about as a typical Russian name as you can get, but he is the head of the section on special settlers in 1941 when they deport the ethnic Germans. And there's a whole bunch of correspondence between him and local NKVD officials that are receiving these deported Germans as to the conditions and what to do. And so he is obsessed with making sure there's no fascist agitation. And he, writes a lot about accommodations. So the local NKVD officials would write and say, we received this huge number of deportees and we have no place to house them and we have no food. And they are getting in conflicts with the locals because they have no food and there's no work to assign them. And so what should we do? And he'd write back, you are not doing your job. Why don't why are you not taking care of this problem? Right? As if the resources would appear from nowhere because there's no offer of any resources here. It's just like stop fascist agitation and try and get these people housing and food so that they can work for on the kolkhozes to grow food for the Red Army, right? And this is like the conversation is like, you're right. It's like will to power. Like I order you to make these people work without food.
Yeah. For some reason, they're starving to death. I can't really figure it out.
Yeah, but you see, nowhere do they really talk about anywhere providing a lot of resources. In some cases, finally, where it becomes absolutely critical to talk about. Okay, now the wealth we stole from them when we deported them and we issued them receipts, right? Yes. You can give them like a little bit of grain in exchange for that as the fair trade that we took all of your property and now we're going to give you a sack of grain for it.
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff that is like pennies on the dollar would be a very generous take on what they were doing, because there's this whole stack of documents about, we took your house, we took everything in it, except literally what you could carry on your back as we were pulling you out the door. And wherever it is that you're going, when you get there, we'll give whatever number of people roughly a day and a half worth of food. And that's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't too far off of that, and it took a long time. And you didn't have the integration, so I think it's November 11th. So the deportation of the Germans is in September from the Volga region. So November 11th is the first decrees saying, give these people some food in exchange for the vouchers for food that was confiscated during the deportation. Now, you're talking about the first deportation, the 3rd September. So 11th of November, that's a long time.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there's this thing that happens a lot in these documents where, and if you've ever dealt with any government ever, it still happens today, where the government goes, well, there's this problem, and then they come back a couple months later and go like, we're here to fix it. And probably the best, the most visceral example right now is the the COVID checks thing, right? Where at this point, realistically speaking, we've handed out what, to $4,000 or something over the course of a year to all of the people that we have put out of work and destroyed their lives and livelihoods. And that sort of general malaise of government is very, very, very pervasive in the Soviet Union. They somebody gets a document about a problem that happened last month and goes, "Oh my God, we got to do something." And a month, 2 months, 6 months later this is what we're going to do.
Yeah, that does happen, and even sometimes you'll see documents that are like written in extreme urgency. So sometimes the local NKVD officials would actually write that we need food for these people in the next 2 to 3 days, or they will just all die, and there will be no workforce here. Or
Yeah.
they've all got typhus, and if you don't take some medical measures, they're going to infect the non deported population, the free population in the next town over through the spread of the disease.
Yes.
And then generally there's like no response. It's like, okay.
Like, we'll let you know. And the thing, this is Soul writes somewhere about this, at least this general premise. He's talking about the Soviet Union. He's talking about farmers who have farms. The farms are functional, and they're trying to requisition equipment. And it's a pretty telling little story insofar as the farmer goes to local official, because that's where you go to get whatever you need. And he says, "Hey, I need tractors to be able to plow this field." And the official says, "Oh, okay, well, go get your tractors." So he goes to the tractor supply guy, and the tractor supply guy says, "Well, I have tractors, but I only have red paint, and these are required to be painted with green paint." And I forget the colors, but I know one of them is red. And not only do I only have green paint, but it is not the right type of green paint. It's not this specific oil brand. And this goes around in circles through the bureaucracy, through what is a whole harvest season time frame, right? So a couple of months until finally somebody up at the top eventually goes, "So paint them green, who cares?" But it takes 6 months because everyone along the way is worried that if they make the executive decision, it will be seen as traitorous and that they could be prosecuted. And so they play this ever-shifting blame game. And the end result of this is that they don't harvest a whole season worth of food because of paint for a tractor. And in that, I think you find what a lot of this failure to act is about, right? Because if you say, well, for the town that doesn't have wood or nails or glass, we'll just go over to the next town and go get it. If that detracts from some other Soviet goal, then you are counter-revolutionary and you should be executed. And so no one ever wants to make a decision because the penalty is death, specifically for failure. And you get this, I don't want to be responsible. And so somebody else make the decision. Every line of the chain of command you go up takes a bunch of time.
Right. And then, of course, there is the opposite problem that the higher levels of the regime want to put all the responsibility on the lower. So this is why they say, supplies are the responsibility of, the Republic and Oblast authorities, and we have nothing to do with it, and we're not going to provide them with any resources. They must magically come up with these new resources out of thin air.
Exactly, because they too are subject to the same thing, right? I mean, under Stalin, specifically, failure was counter-revolutionary activity. So the only person in the USSR not subject to this was Stalin. He was the only person who could make a decision without a bullet being the answer to his failure. And it didn't really matter that, even some of the times when he tells people to do stuff, they fail doing exactly what he told them to do. And he goes, well, the problem is that you didn't care enough about the revolution. So into the gulag, go out back and get your bullet, whatever it is, but go away, because failure is not an option here. And it brings this risk aversion to the point of absurdity thing.
But
To
what
every
it
level
is,
of government.
what it is though, it's baked in the cake that certain actions are going to have inevitable results, because the resources aren't there. Every time you move one of these groups of people, and by the 1940s they're all ethnically based, right? They're not going to all die, right? It's not going to be 100% die out, but a large minority will inevitably die because the resources are not there.
Yeah,
And
oh yeah.
exactly what happened the time before they weren't there, that they're not going to magically appear. So with the lack of food and housing and medical care and warm clothing, these people who lose all of their property in their homeland as they are sent on trains eastward are going to suffer a massive decline in population as a result of premature deaths from material deprivation. And it's hard to say that this is an accident. Because it's quite clear that the removement of the people is intentional, and it's quite clear that they know what will happen, and it's quite clear they just don't care.
It seems sort of like, and again, it's never really said. It's just a thing that you sort of, after you watch enough of this sort of thing, to be fair, 100 years in retrospect sometimes, but after you watch them do this enough time through documentation, it seems a lot like, well, if half of them live, that is success, right? And
Right, because
it's not
we'll
even like,
use the other half. We'll use the surviving half as labor, and
yeah,
100% of them will be gone from the territory that we cleansed them from. And if half of them die dispersed across Soviet Asia, that should solve the problem of them being troublesome.
indeed. And it sounds callous and horrible, but maybe if you want to be particularly generous, you could say, well, the first time they did this, they didn't actually know, except that they knew, right? And there's some people who talk about it in advance. This is going to kill a lot of people, and we can't stop it. If we pick all these people up and we move them, some are going to die just because of the trip, and maybe that's unavoidable. But even after we move them, there's nothing there, and wherever we're going to put them. And it comes up a couple of times because they debate doing this before they do it more than once, and you get this, a lot of people going, well, are we really going to kill a few 100,000 people? And to be fair to them, in the beginning, they think it's not going to be millions. They think it's going to be a few 100,000. And the answer is kind of, yeah,
Right, but certainly once you get past the first major deportation in 30 and 31, I think it's quite apparent that this is the pattern established.
Oh, yeah.
And then, of course, it happens again with the deportation of the Koreans from the Far East into Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and then again and again. So it's and at this point, there is no concerted effort to actually make sure any of the areas of deportation or any of the camps or special for forced labor have sufficient supplies to keep all of the population alive. It is at the very minimum a significant minority, and by significant minority, we're talking around 20%,
Yeah.
will die.
And they, even when those numbers are up, because there's a couple of times where they get pretty high. I want to say one of them is near 40% or something like that of the people they move die, and
Well, the Chechens are over a third, so yeah.
Yeah, it's 37 or something like that. I think, again, I'm quoting you.
I don't know if I put that number in there, but yeah, it's again, we have a problem with these numbers, but what we do
Oh, yeah.
have suggests it's very high. So we're talking the Chechens at least 30%.
Yeah. And it's not even that they say that's fine. It's just sort of shrug, that's the way it is, and move on. It is the ultimate embodiment of the term acceptable losses. It seems to be the way that they look at it. It's just, yeah, that's fine. Like, well, noted. That's how many we lost.
All right. So I think we've covered through dekulakization 3031. So I wanted to talk about the 3738. I sent you that very short piece by Morris on Polish operation. So one of the things that is apparent during the Great Terror at 37, 38, they run out of class enemies to kill and start killing enemy peoples, ethnically based enemies, particularly the Polish and German operations, although there are Latvian, Finnish, Estonian, Greek operations as well. And so here, as you said before the show, that Stalin became very good at ethnic killing because there's no more class enemies really to kill after 37. So now we have to have enemy peoples to kill.
Indeed. And I, again, because it's hard to get directly into these people's heads, but this is one of those things that I basically, anywhere I find it, I find this game where you go to ethnicity as it's very easy. It's very simple, right? If you are a German, if you are a Jew, if you are a Finn, because in case anybody's wondering, the Soviets were not big fans of Jews most of the time either. If you are ethnicity that causes us a problem, and interestingly enough, to the point that Stalin had his pictures taken at specific angles to make himself look less Georgian, because the Georgians come up in this at some point, where they start talking about, well, these Georgians are a big problem, and Stalin goes, no profile pictures of me then. And it's why you see all of Stalin's pictures taken from about this angle, give or take, somewhere like right in this area, right? So the camera's always over here because, I don't have a particularly small nose. And if you do this, you can tell. And if you do this, you can't, right? So it influences all kinds of stuff once you start doing it. But it's this game where, you play the same thing we're doing now, right? So the black community, it's that the white people hate you. And you can visually identify these things, and it makes it, my community doesn't necessarily get along entirely with that community, and there, I think it's the German discussion is at one very specific point they move from the problem being fascist to the problem being Germans, and it's just all at once, like in one day.
Yes, and if you look at they changed the headline. It becomes they stop using the word fascist and start just using the word German. So you in the Soviet propaganda posters in the middle of the war, and this becomes generalized to everybody of German ancestry. So not just the German government in Berlin or citizens of Germany, but also the almost 1.5 million Soviet citizens descended of German immigrants. So they are targeted for forced removal into Siberia and Kazakhstan, and then a mobilization into forced labor in the Urals. because they are German and therefore must think like the German government in Berlin. But yeah, at this they stopped using the word fascist and just refer to Germans in the propaganda. So it's obviously moved from a political discussion to an ethnic one.
Indeed. But it also gives you perpetual enemy, which is just a necessity of totalitarianism, right? You always need somebody, and so until you get to ethnic purity of extreme degrees, you will always have someone to blame. Oh, he was 1/74th German, therefore, yeah, it was his fault.
Well, Soviets didn't do fractions, so they had the law was based upon your biological parentage, and
Yep.
usually people were not of mixed nationality, so it was high level endogamy. Uh, when they deport the Volga Germans, they let women who have non-German husbands remain,
Yeah.
and there's like 1,000 out of 450,000, so it's quite small.
Yeah.
But so you do have a few cases, but not very many. But generally, people took the nationality of their father if it wasn't the same as their mother. But you could legally choose at age 16 if you had parents of different nationality. So, for
Well, that's
instance,
interesting.
Alfred Schnittke, whose father was a Jew from Germany who moved to the Volga German ASSR to be a Russian German translator and married Maria Volga, who was a Lutheran Volga German and a Volga German activist in the 1960s to restore the Volga German ASSR and editor of the German language newspaper in Moscow, Neues Leben. Her family was not deported. So Schnittke was born in Engels of a German mother and a Jewish father as far as the legal categories of people here. Obviously, in both cases, their native language is German. Uh, but he considered himself to be German on his mother's side, and he later in life converted, I believe, to the Russian Orthodox Church. Uh, so you have some cases where it goes to the mother's side, uh, but usually people would take the father's nationalnost.
See, that's an interesting thing because there's a few times later in the Soviet Union, and I am not anywhere near as familiar with, say, post 60s Soviet Union as I am at the beginning, um, because there's just so much reading to do on all of it. But there's a few times later on where they reference that sort of thing and say things like, your mother was whatever, something that was not a part of the Soviet movement. And don't get me wrong, that comes a lot more along political lines, but it does carry on some of the ethnicity lines. I guess the question there sort of becomes which they cared about more, and it's hard to tell. I'm sure it was whatever's most politically expedient, though.
Right. But there are some of these people who are mixed nationality who are heavily identified with one side. So Schnittke heavily identifies with his German mother's side rather than any Jewishness on his father's side. Although his father, coming from Germany and being a German speaker, I guess is in many ways culturally German. But there's a famous Estonian dissident who had a Ukrainian parent, half Ukrainian, half Estonian, who was very much Estonian nationalist. There were some German emigration activists out of Estonia that had a Russian mother, German father. The opposite of Schnittke, that are heavily involved in the movement to emigrate to West Germany. So in some cases, I have a Kurdish colleague who states that the strongest nationalists are always people that are marginal in the nation. So you see a lot of Arab nationalists who are part Assyrian. You
Yeah.
see a lot of Kurdish nationalists who are part Arab.
Well, I mean, it's a thing that you can hold on to, claim is more important than ethnicity, and then not have it come for you, right? So if you're dealing with a lot of authoritarianism, that makes a lot of sense.
Right. So maybe overcompensation in some senses, but it is something you can note across a number of places where you do have people of mixed heritage who are very strongly nationalist up for one side of their bloodline.
Yeah. Well, that it's probably self-preservation is what it comes down to.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, certainly, it could be. But in the cases I mentioned, I mean, there's the old joke about a girl who goes to the passport office and they ask her what her nationality is, and she says Kalmuk, which is one of the people deported by Stalin to Siberia in their entirety in 1943. And they say, "That's unfortunate. Don't you have a better nationality?" And she says, "Well, my mother is Jewish." And says, "Well, let's see if we can find something even better." you know. But so you also get in this problem that if you're half German and half Polish, or uh, you don't have any good options.
Right. Where does that okay, so where were we at? Moving Germans, I think was last we were
Yeah,
talking about.
that was my a piece published in the Russian Review in 2016, which is kind of the core type of argument of the much larger and more detailed book I'll have coming out soon.
See, now I'll have to go. You'll have to tell me the title, and I'll have to
The
actually.
Years of Great Silence. As I said, waiting for the contract, but it has been offered and drafted and sent, so I just need to get it.
If I don't write this down, I'll forget it. So it's just how I am. So, that's what we were talking about. Was the beginning of we're just getting into moving around the poles, and you'll have
Right,
to forgive
the
me.
37, 38 Polish operation. There's no more class enemies, so now ethnic enemies are on the block to be persecuted.
See, and I don't like to just shrug past this, because guaranteeably there is some political expediency to this, but it's also sort of the nature of how these things go, right? If the class enemies were anywhere near as malicious as Stalin in particular, though Lenin alike, had thought that they were, there's a very good chance that the Soviet Union would have fallen under Stalin.
But they almost did. Vladimir Brovkin argues that had collectivization and dekulakization not occurred in 1929, that the Soviets would have lost control of the countryside, much like the Chinese did after the Cultural Revolution, and what Deng Xiaoping basically had to uh, legalize capitalism in the Chinese countryside because the collectivized agriculture, the commune system, had completely fallen apart.
Yeah. But even see that's an internal issue, right? And if you listen to how they talk about capitalist encirclement, is I mean, it's their term, not mine, and how everybody, all of the capitalistic farms are some product of either the Germans or the Americans, almost always. That these things were astroturfed propaganda type things, and that the only reason they existed was not because people just do that, people just do capitalistic things, but rather because some outside influence was forcing it in some never defined way. The capitalists are coming for us is just the way that they talk about it, and there's effectively no evidence of any variety that any of that ever happened. And so, had the capitalists of the world been trying to push capitalism in there in a way that we are substantially more familiar with things like, I don't know, Afghanistan, right, where we're actually doing proxy war things, right, or Vietnam or any of those things. Excuse me, had capitalists actually.
Ironically, the best development of capitalism in Vietnam has been done by the Vietnamese Communist Party long after their victory in Saigon.
Yes. But that is again more of a failure of communism than it is of the outside forces pushing in. And there's some decent possibility that if the capitalists of the world, or even the fascists, were willing to push into the Soviet Union and had some real capability to, let's be honest, the Soviet Union probably would have had untenable problems, and even post collectivization in 29 would not have been able to withstand it. A lot of the way that they got to stick around is because everyone just sort of sat and watched. And it's not until, Reagan, effectively, that you start to see somebody having a big push on the Soviet Union, even though they act like somebody is, straight from Lenin, right? Immediately after the revolution is over, right? I mean, it's never really over, but, 1919, they're talking about capitalist encirclement and how the capitalists are coming, and how this is a big problem.
We had a few guys in Arkhangelsk and Vladivostok that they could point to and say, "Look, interventionist."
Right. Yeah. And it really is like some random guy, right?
Well, I mean, there was U.S. military deployed in those areas, but I mean, they were so ineffective in opposing the Bolsheviks that they were never. That wasn't what threatened. I mean, as far as the Bolsheviks almost being overthrown, it was from domestic forces.
Yeah, the Mensheviks almost killed them 2 or 3 times, like as the whole party.
Fanny Kaplan was a SR, and she shot Lenin. He survived initially, but then he had 3 strokes, which are probably related to the bullet that was put in him by her.
I mean, it's a reasonable assertion, and I certainly have never seen, the Lenin's medical records. So, but getting shot has deleterious effects, we'll say.
But certainly, we look at the period, the Russian Civil War, which is a bit earlier. It's there where the Bolsheviks are almost overthrown by Kolchak and then Denikin. There's no British or French or American or Japanese forces anywhere near the crucial battles. The only force that was of significance was the Japanese, and their goal was just kind of try and grab resources in the Far East. And the Soviets actually capitulate to that. They signed concessions, which are in force all the way up until Japan is defeated in August 1945.
Yeah, Stalin does some talking about this at some point, about how he doesn't really want to keep enforcing these things, but it's the least important thing on his plate or something like that. I forget exactly what term he uses, but it's something like, yeah, we've got to get around to that eventually, is his take on it. And then, I mean, conveniently, we nuked Japan a couple of times, and he just that'll do. So
Right. That's then they move into Manchuria and southern Sakhalin.
there,
Uh,
there's some discussion, and I honestly don't know, but there's some discussion that Stalin gives a lot of that to Mao, or makes motions that he's going to. A lot of the resource stuff that specifically the Japanese were holding. Mao shows up and he says, "Well, I mean, we weren't using it anyway," kind of things.
well, the weapons, the armament they capture from the Goman, not the Kwangtung army of the Japanese in Manchuria, that's all handed over to Mao.
That's what it is.
And so this huge arsenal of Japanese weapons goes to the Chinese communists under Mao in Manchuria. And this allows them to hold the territory when the U.S. gives a sea lift to the Kuomintang forces under Chiang Kai-shek. So in southern China, the U.S. basically Navy gives a ride to the Chinese army into Manchuria, but the communists are able to hold the territory, repulse the nationalist forces. And this is what allows in 1949 Mao to march into Beijing successfully as victorious. So there's a lot of period of time where the Chinese are resentful under Mao of the Soviets being rather stingy with aid, but they do hand over these Japanese armaments that they capture in Manchuria because the Soviets, of course, have enough of their own weapons. They have one thing they could produce
The only thing.
was armament. So the Japanese weapons are given over to the Chinese communists, who are effectively able to use them because other than armaments, the Chinese Communist forces by that time are a fairly good fighting force when it comes to fighting against the Chinese nationalists, even if they do not do nearly so well when they fight against the U.S. A little bit later in Korea.
No, but there's interesting things about that, because if you read the American side of that stuff, you go read colonels who were on the ground and that sort of thing. There's a few captains and majors that have written books as well, and they talk about the Chinese were the serious fighting force of Korea, and that they had much bigger problems fighting the Chinese than they did the Koreans, because the Koreans were they had a lot of Chinese weapons and that sort of thing, but they didn't really know how to fight, and so they we'd cut down Korean forces pretty quickly, and the Chinese, they weren't particularly spectacular fighters, but there were enough of them that were trained well enough that it was a giant problem.
Yeah, well, obviously the Chinese intervention force was much more effective. So the North Korean army basically is destroyed as the U.S. advances towards the Yalu. So the last 2/3 of the Korean War is completely basically
Yeah.
a U.S. Chinese war in Korea.
Mm-hmm. And there's God, I forget who it is. I always want to say it's Hackworth, but it's not Hackworth. Some other guy who was a colonel at around that time is talking about he was enlisted at the time in Korea, and he was frontline fighting, and at a certain point, he doesn't make any big mention of it, but they just stopped talking about Koreans. It's so we were fighting the Chinese, and then there were waves of Chinese, and we knew, there's a very brief period where, we knew we were fighting Chinese instead of Koreans because it was just huge waves, wave after wave after wave, and they, they would fight in usually 3 waves of attack, and then in bigger, larger scale attacks, they would fight in 5 waves of attack, and it was, they'd run you out of bullets with bodies, because eventually you don't have enough ammo to shoot people anymore.
Right. It's hard to fight a war of attrition against a country that has 3 to 4 times your total population.
Yeah, and they they were much less scrupulous with who they would send than we were. So, you don't, there's talks about Americans finding Chinese who were in their 50s as frontline troops, right? Not generals, but just, well, you can still walk, you can still carry a rifle, ready, go.
Wow. So we're getting a little bit off track, but
they're also related.
They are related. Stalin was still alive during most of the Korean War. He dies before the armistice is signed, but
Yeah,
certainly Soviet arms, and particularly air power, but also these ethnic Koreans that were deported from the Soviet Far East. A number of them are sent as military advisors from Soviet Central Asia to support Kim Il Sung in North Korea. And Kim Il Sung is very clever, Machiavellian, and intelligent. All of the ethnic Koreans sent from the Soviet Union, as well as those from China, to take positions in the North Korean government, are purged out and killed because they might be a potential threat backed by these other powers against Kim Il Sung himself.
Well, suspicion is the thing that keeps you alive in these, dictatorships, effectively. So I don't know if I blame him.
So yeah, the Soviet faction is removed after the Korean War. There was a period of time for about 5 years where the Chinese military is hanging around North Korea to rebuild what the U.S. bombed. This is the main reason they're able to kind of recover their industrial production is the Chinese army just becomes a giant construction crew in North Korea. But because Mao is independent of Stalin, this also allows Kim Il Sung to become independent of Moscow.
Yeah. Their internal politics on this is complicated.
Well, I think we can look at it at the North Korean communists were clever. They were the only communist regime that was imposed by the Soviet military. Kim Il Sung comes in with the Soviet military at the end of the Second World War when they partitioned Korea as the occupation after the Japanese, that is able to become really completely independent of Moscow. So all of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe that are occupied by the Soviets, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, even Romania, which does assert some independence, are largely controlled in terms of their foreign policy and other aspects of the decision-making process from Moscow rather than locally, whereas the North Koreans basically do what they want to and are able to get Soviet assistance to do it.
I have to wonder if part of that is Mao.
A lot of it is. I think it's the fact that the Chinese are hanging around in North Korea rebuilding cities from 53 to 58, and this is the period of time when the Soviet Koreans are all purged out of the North Korean regime.
Well, the other thing that happens right then is Stalin dies, right?
He died 5th of March, 53, so before the end of the Korean War, I think.
Right, but Mao cuts his teeth dealing with Stalin.
Right.
And Stalin is significantly
Mao wanted to be the Chinese Stalin. He wanted to be like Stalin, but he be Stalin rather than Stalin be Stalin.
Indeed. And when the Soviet Union changes hands out from under Stalin, there's this thing that happens where Mao, when he's going to talk to Stalin, is almost subservient.
Right.
He's very it's not subservience, not quite the right word, but he's very respectful at bare minimum of Stalin.
The power and status relations are clear that the Soviet Union been around longer, more developed socialist state, and Stalin is the man who did that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, after Stalin dies, Mao points out correctly that the the most single successful socialist statesman is no longer in the Soviet Union. It's him. So
Yeah.
he should get the respect, and he has the mantle of Joseph Stalin. So there is actually this weird thing where because he's the model, but not that while Stalin is alive, Mao has a lot of personal problems with him because he isn't Stalin. But once
Right.
Stalin dies, Stalin becomes kind of the glorified model because
Yeah.
this is what Mao is shooting for, this becomes the kind of we filter out various forms of national communism. So Lenin inspires Stalin, Stalin inspires Mao, Mao inspires Pol Pot. Pol
Right.
Pot inspires whoever's head of Black Lives Matter, and
Exactly. But this is the thing, is that the Korea, while Stalin's alive, Stalin is much more brutal in his mandating Moscow control, even if somewhat tenuously, right? Moscow is, Stalin notoriously reads 300 pages of reports every night. And so he is hands-on, even from a massive distance, with what's going on in the USSR. And what came after him was not at any point was it anywhere near so iron-fisted as it was when Stalin's around. And so once, being as Stalin died precisely when he did, there was no time, effectively, that Korea was not in some sort of conflict, that the Soviet Union was there, that Stalin's in charge, right? And so you don't end up with that nice Soviet iron grip on it that Stalin would have established, and you end up with Mao as kind of a buffer zone. And then once Stalin dies, Mao's like, well, that's mine now, thanks, right? And to this day, what are we, 70 years later almost, North Korea couldn't exist without China, because Mao had gone back as Stalin would have, right? And he puts China's iron grip on Korea.
right, but I mean, obviously, there's hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers in North Korea.
That helps a lot.
All the way until, as I said, 1958 is when they leave. So
Yeah.
there's 5 years where they are no longer fighting against the United States, but basically they're construction crew. They're rebuilding what the United States destroyed during the war.
Indeed. But Mao uses that time to solidify a lot of power and create what is still kind of a parasitic relationship between Korea and China, where Korea doesn't really contribute a lot, but China takes care of them quite a bit. And that's most of their history, as far as I can tell, to be fair.
You mean of the DPRK?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, basically the Korean War, as I said, the Chinese intervention basically allows Kim Il Sung to use the Chinese as a way of getting out from under Moscow.
Yeah.
So he is no longer like the other communist regimes that were put in place by the Red Army, where they are basically don't have any ability to be independent of Moscow.
But I think the reasoning for this is because Stalin dies precisely when he does. And don't get me wrong, if Stalin had lived 6 months,
yeah, maybe, but it's hard to say that if he'd lived another year, that the Chinese under. I mean, Mao is also. I mean, as brilliant as Stalin is, so was Mao.
Yeah.
And so here we have one of these things. While the communist bloc always wants to put up a common face against the capitalist enemy, right? In the case of the Soviet Union, China, even that wasn't possible. They almost go to war in 1969. There's a military skirmish at Damansky Island. I guess the Chinese call it Zhenbao. But there's a little tiny island in the Ussuri River they fight over.
Yeah.
So they were unable to prevent tensions from leading to even military conflict.
Well, so this is why I think it matters that Stalin died when he did. One, Mao, right along with that respect, seems to have sort of some fear of Stalin. I mean, again, you don't ever get to say out loud, but the way
this is because the head of Chinese security, Kang Sheng, was pretty close to Stalin. He was in Moscow during the 37-38 terror. He interrogated the ethnic Chinese that were expelled en masse, about 50,000 of them, into China. So the communists actually got all of the information and documents on the Chinese in the Soviet Union before the Kuomintang got it, when they arrested these guys coming back into China and interrogated them themselves. So it was always this fear, and of course, the Soviets at one time under Stalin had the idea that instead of supporting a unified China, we could break it up. So we have a East Turkestan, People's Republic, and then a Manchurian People's Republic, and there were Chinese communists as well as non-ethnic Chinese, non-Han, so people who are Uyghur and Manchu and Mongol, that like this idea. Make me the head of my own national state, allied with the Soviet Union, separate from China itself. So this is, I think, was the leverage they had over, because Mao doesn't really consolidate his power in the non-Chinese periphery until the late 50s, early 60s. There's the crushing of the Tibetan uprising in 1959.
See, that's the time I had it pegged at, is 59, because probably of that. But this is why I say it matters that Stalin died when he did, because Stalin's answer to these things was brutally efficient most of the time. When the Soviet Union rolled into places under Stalin, he was very good at establishing his own dictatorial control from afar of the power structure there. He knew how to make friends that would establish him a dictatorship. And I don't think in Stalin's opinion, again, mostly guessing from the outputs here, that he really thought he had time with China to do that by the time that he died, is what it comes down to, right? But
I don't even think it was impossible to do with China. That's why there was this backup plan to break China up. And of course, even if Mao is in control of the Chinese part, if they lose the resources of Manchuria and other peripheral areas, that would be a much lesser prize to rule over. So
indeed,
in many ways, China and Yugoslavia are the two big failures of the Soviet government to create puppet regime. And in one sense, you can almost blame Trotsky for China's failure because of the 1927 Shanghai uprising. And this puts, when Mao retreats into the countryside, Mao on the rise to when he gets to in the Politburo in 37 in Yenin, and then interviewed by Edgar Snow, who writes Red Star over China, and Mao becomes internationally famous. Had the Shanghai uprising been successful, doubtful that Mao would have come to the fore, and the Chinese communists that would have succeeded would have probably been long-term much more pro-Soviet than Mao was.
Well, hard to say for certain, but it's hard to match, Mao's ambition. So probably,
yeah. But interestingly enough, the guy who was responsible for crushing the communist uprising in 1927 was a guy named Big Ear Du, who was actually not part of the Gomandang apparatus. He was just a gangster. He was also very important in resisting the Japanese. So Big Ear Du was a gangster in Shanghai in the opium and the prostitution and all that good, honest capitalist business. But he's also the great uncle of one of my good friends. So
That's some pretty small world stuff.
uh-huh. And if you want to read on the deportation of the ethnic Koreans, that particular friend of mine has written the foremost book in English on it. It's called "Burnt by the Sun" by John K. Chang. So I'll put a plug in there for him.
Again, I'm going to have to write this down.
Yeah. So let me see.
Chang?
Yeah, he is. Let me see. Here's the Amazon link to his book, University of Hawaii Press. I'll put that in the chat for people. It is on the 19th. It's on the Koreans in the Soviet Union. But mostly the 1920s and 30s, and particularly the 37 deportation.
Let's see if YouTube chat will behave itself.
It's rather expensive, but the Kindle version is affordable. The paperback version is not too bad. $28 for paperback.
Well, this is, as I keep telling people, this is
$7 for Kindle.
Yeah, that's doable. So
forget the hardback. I didn't realize my hardback was worth that much.
See, this is the problem. You need to just start uppricing those books. But let's see here. Now that we've gotten substantially distracted from Stalin, where were we talking about last?
Oh, well, we were the Polish operation, the Morris piece, and then my piece where we go to, instead of just disproportionate targeting and arrest, of course, executions as well, to forcibly removing whole population. So this is, I guess, a good segue because the first population forcibly resettled in almost its entirety is the ethnic Koreans in the Soviet Far East into Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan in 1937. During the same time, they are arresting large numbers of Poles, Germans, Latvians, and shooting them.
I have to wonder why, and I don't recall if it's in there. Why the Koreans first?
Because of conflict with Japan, because of the problems in the Far East, particularly there was Japan takes Manchuria in 1931, but the Soviets still have the railroad that the Russians built. Mm-hmm. They took in control over, and there's the railroad there is still run by the Soviets, even though the Japanese control the territory now. And there's also the workforce for the railroad, which is in the city of Harbin. So there's a lot of Soviet citizens working in Manchuria now under Japanese rule that are Soviet citizens, mostly ethnic Russians, but there's Ukrainian, Jews, Georgians, etc. And so we now start to see their conflict between Japan and the Soviet Union over this. So the Soviets do sell the railroad, and they recall the Harbinsi back to the Soviet Union. And there's actually a Harbinsi operation where large numbers of them are arrested and sent to labor camps and shot because having been in China, they're suspect. When I lived in Bishkek, one of my neighbors was one of these guys who he was lucky enough not to get shot. He just spent some time in a labor camp as a but he had worked on the railroad in Harbin. Very old guy by that time. This was 2007, 2008. So there's a conflict there, and there had been always this kind of idea that the Korean population in the Soviet Union could be a cover for ethnic Koreans sent by the Japanese Empire to kind of use them as surrounding camouflage. They might say, "I'm just one of the Soviet Koreans related to these people," and
Right.
when they're actually sent from Japanese-ruled Korea or ethnic Korean from Japan. Of course, in reality, the Japanese spies sent into the Soviet Union were almost all European, ethnic Russians, ethnic Georgians, ethnic Estonians, and almost none of them were Koreans because all the Koreans hated the Japanese as part of their DNA or as a result of Japanese colonial rule. And the Koreans in the Soviet Far East tended to be very pro-Soviet and loyal. But we had this idea of this cover being an excuse for older ideas that had been advocated starting in Tsarist time, but picking up again among Soviet ethnographers in the 1920s of there's no way to really assimilate East Asian people into what we consider to be the core Soviet group. So this idea starts to bubble up that the Soviet Union is really an East Slav state. So it's a Russian core, and Ukrainians and Belarusians and assimilated Jews can be integrated into the power structure, but Chinese and Koreans cannot because they are just too far biologically and genetically away from that core.
Well, I guess that sort of makes sense. Back to the paranoia game is you struck the paranoia first, so you got to be first.
You can. There's a lot written on it, but obviously there is more going on than just the claim that the Japanese can use the Korean population as cover for infiltrators. There's basically an excuse. We can make the Soviet Far East a whites-only area, and this will secure what we think of as a version of Soviet man. That these non-East Slavic peoples should be confined to Central Asia.
That's interesting because that almost makes it seem like they're setting up kind of a buffer zone almost. Because the Soviets have some kind of trouble on that side of the Soviet Union the whole time they have the Soviet Union. Something is always going on the eastern side that is, none of it is ever threat to the Soviet Union about to fall apart, but it is a constant trouble. The Japanese are over there taking some space and resources off them for a while.
Well, it was more than that. Industrially, Manchuria under Japanese rule produced more manufactured goods than all of the Japanese home island. In fact, some of the largest Japanese corporations, including Nissan, were founded in Manchuria while it was under Japanese rule in the 1930s. So it was really the core of the Japanese empire.
Gotcha. So that's interesting because if maybe they're not creating a buffer zone, that I wonder if they're doing it as a place, and I don't know. Are they working on setting this up as what amounts to a staging area? Because if you have disloyal people in an area, then what you can't do is create a safe base, militarily speaking, to move forward. Right? You You can't have the logistical hub or any of those sorts of things have a lot of uprising around them. You can have it 20 miles away, but you can't have it physically right there. And that's a good reason to do it, cynically speaking, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, the problem, of course, is that in the case of the Koreans, unlike, say, the Poles or the Germans or the Turks, there is no independent Korean state. So Korea is a colony of Japan,
Right.
and the Koreans everywhere hate the Japanese, and the Koreans in the Soviet Union have proven themselves in the 1920s and 1930s to be a super, to overcompensate loyalty to the communist government in Moscow, in part because of their hatred of the Japanese.
Yes, but you don't get a superficial view of that, right? You don't get you would need to know things about them to know that. Does that make sense? Like
Right, but I
in an
mean, the
actual
Soviet government
practical,
knew that there were, large numbers of Koreans joining the Communist Party and the Komsomol, and knew that they had volunteered in large numbers to fight with the Bolsheviks against the Japanese intervention and the white forces.
yeah. But does the Red Army know that? Is, I guess, the question that
Well, the Red
boils
Army
down to.
isn't doing the removal, the NKVD. And interestingly enough, the man and head of it, the head of the NKVD in the Soviet Far East in 1937, is a man named Genrikh Lyushkov. And after the mass deportation of the ethnic Koreans, he believes that Stalin is going to come for him as part of the purge of the NKVD in 1938. So he flees to the Japanese, and he's in Manchuria. And the Japanese interrogate him and execute him before the very end of the war. I think in 1945, he is interrogated and executed by the Japanese. And the Americans, we got the interrogation records from the Kempete when we occupied Japan. So we knew a little bit about what was happening there at that time. It's pretty obvious that they were aware that there was no evidence that the Japanese had been able to use the Koreans. It was only a prophylactic potential in the deportation decrees possibility. I mean, the same thing when they deport the Volga Germans. They say there are tens of thousands of Germans awaiting orders from Berlin and the Volga to set off explosions. And the evidence that there are all these traitors is we haven't been able to find anybody because they're so well hidden.
Well, the thing about that is that both of those are sort of militaristic considerations, right? Because so much of the kinetic portion of policing, as it were, is done by the Red Army or some very close facsimile of it.
The NKVD has a military wing. They call it the internal troops. So, and they
Right.
do use for the German deportation Red Army soldiers that are put under NKVD command. But the Red Army itself is not involved in this any of this decision making.
No, but guaranteed they're handing down tactical.
What they do get is a lot of the places, the villages that the Koreans are deported from in 1937 are settled by Red Army veterans. So they bring in people from that have been discharged recently from the Soviet Red Army, and they're almost all Russians and Ukrainians and Belarusians to settle in these regions on the border with Manchuria.
See, again, that sounds like a long-term strategic concern, right? Because Moscow spent a lot of time in the beginning and middle concentrating on getting sort of back. It's sort of the reason that they take Poland. It's sort of the reason that they go after parts of the Nordic region for a while, is that at any point the Russian czars had controlled any part of it, and therefore they should be sort of accepting of a USSR. Is their It's sort of the way that they frame it. Is well, if we controlled Poland in the past, then they know how we are, or something like is the premise. And they somewhere along the way, Stalin actually says something to the effect of, well, we had Poland once, so we can have it again. And then the Germans sort of say, well, we're just going to take the rest of Poland. And that's a different argument, but I mean, that's the beginning of Russia turning against Germany.
But to be honest, as Vladimir Tishkov, who was head of the ethnography wing of the Academy of Soviet Sciences after Bromley died, so becomes the Russian Academy of Sciences then under Tishkov, stated nobody in any of the secondary literature has ever given a satisfactory reason for why there are these national deportations in the Soviet Union, right? So we don't have the stenographic records from the Politburo decisions. About all we know is that, except for Mikoyan, an Armenian who abstained, that the rest of the Politburo all voted yes on all these deportations. So we know Kaganovich and Molotov voted for them. We know Voroshilov voted for it. We know Beria voted for it. But we don't know what what the discussion was and what it was. And of course, in the internal documents, usually it just says deport them. And in the published ones, it'll always say, they're guilty of treason, or they could be used for treason. But we don't have, any real, right? Reason. We just have the official cover your ass justification, story. Right? And then everything else is speculation.
That's interesting, because this seems like one of those things that would be helpful to know, because it's
from the point of view of the people being deported, it's irrelevant. They're deporting me because they're prejudiced against me. Do they actually believe their own bullshit? Is there some weird esoteric reason that only the genius insanity of Joseph Stalin understands? It doesn't really matter from that point of view of the guy loaded onto the cattle car.
Yeah, well, there's a quote at the end of the Chernobyl series that sums this up. Scientists always worried about the reason why. When the bullet hits your forehead, what does it matter?
Right.
I'm sure that's a misquote, but that's the premise, and it's certainly on the receiving end that's always true. But there is a lot of thought and planning that goes into a lot of these things. Ironically, not in the places where you would like to see it if you actually cared about any of these people or anything like that. But there's almost a lot of the things that seem totally irrational once you get the Central Committee discussion about it most helpfully. All of a sudden it's not ridiculously irrational. All of a sudden it's not crazy cynicism that is driving this sort of thing. So here's to hoping that somebody finds out what that discussion was at some point. Where
I don't think there is the discussion. My gut instinct is that these decisions were made rather summarily. This is why they were unanimous, except for the abstention. He didn't vote against it by Anastas Mikoyan, who himself, you will note, is of a minority group. Is Armenian, not a Russian, and far less Russified than people like Stalin and Beria, who, well, maybe not so much Beria, but certainly less so than Stalin.
Right.
and certainly much much less so than Kaganovich, who even though he's Jewish is heavily Russified. So Mikoyan has still his roots in Armenia. That might explain, since there were Armenians outside of Armenia who were deported from the Crimea and the Black Sea region into
Yeah.
the Urals and Siberia in 44 and 49. But it may just be, these groups, the people that are diasporas, their history and ethnicity is in bulk outside the Soviet Union. They can't ever be trusted because they weren't formed by the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, so we go after them. And these
Might
other
be.
peoples who have traditionally resisted Russian and Soviet rule, like the Chechens and Crimean Tatars and Kalmucks, the war is a good time to have a final solution.
So there's some decent evidence of that with specifically, I think, the Chechens.
Right, because they have a revolt that starts in 1940 and doesn't
right.
end until the deportation.
Right. But maybe that's what it is they just, well, you know what? We do have a few problems with a few of these, so let's just settle that for everybody. Because that seems like a rationalization that communists could get behind.
But but we don't have them ever saying that, right? We don't. I don't think there are were ever any written records, or if there were, they were destroyed of these meetings for it. So we just know that okay, Politburo approves the resolution by the Central Committee and Council of People's Commissariat to round up every member of this nationality in their homeland and dump them in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah. So one of the things that has been interesting over the past couple of years is that Central Committee meetings were often documented by the KGB. So I don't know if by some miracle this ever comes out. Let me know, because I would love to go read that.
Again, I don't think that we're going to find out. I think Tishkov's a statement that we don't have anything that's really satisfactory is for a reason, right? Because the reason officially the Soviets gave are obvious bullshit. So we know that they could not have believed this when we look at the facts. But it also seems to me, and I think what I said, that the diaspora groups and traditional groups that had traditionally resisted Russian and Soviet rule, it was looked at as an opportune time to deal with them and get them out of the way. And so we have a opportunity of the war combined with historical problems, which are combined with long-term ethnic prejudices.
That's very possible. I don't know. I don't know. I like esoteric points. What can I say?
Well, I mean, it could be, and if people are honest, generally they're not. Some might just say, it may just be you have a Politburo that's dominated by Stalin and Beria and Molotov and Kaganovich. These aren't people that are particularly favorable to these minorities. They might have just said, you know what? Fuck it. These people, I don't like them. Let's just deport them into Siberia and Kazakhstan.
I mean, it's. I would love to say that's unreasonable, but they do so many things that, at bare minimum, seem that kind of shrug your shoulders and go. So maybe it is.
So obviously, it is a factor. These long-term ethnic prejudices against these people. But you have the statement by Khrushchev at the 20th Party Congress that said the only reason Stalin didn't deport the Ukrainians is there were too many of them and no place to put them.
Yeah, it's true. They needed a lot more Soviet Union before they could do anything with that. But
They had a lot of Soviet Union, but yeah, I mean, the point being, though, I mean, obviously, the idea that this is a real security threat, or that there was massive collaboration and treason during the war by these peoples compared to other people doesn't hold up when you look at the historical record. And it was obvious that the Soviet government knew it didn't hold up. So their official justification is just a justification.
Well, that poses an interesting question, though, because they were really subject to any paranoid theory being given credence. So whereas that is probably not a guiding principle, it's entirely possible that was scribbled on the side of a note somewhere along the way. And whenever they wrote the propaganda, they went, "Oh, this scribbling sounds good," and wrote that on there.
Maybe. But I mean, we can look at a number. So, like, one of the things that comes up, if you look at the deportations between November 43 and November 44, particularly people in the North Caucasus who are accused of collaborating with the Nazis and committing mass treason. For instance, you look at the Karachay population. There's percentage-wise a lot more Karachais fighting in the Red Army than fought on the German side.
Yeah.
And if you look at other peoples in the North Caucasus who are not deported, for instance, the Avars or the Azerbaijanis, there's a lot more of them fighting on the German side, percentage-wise. So you have to kind of figure there's something more going on than what happened in the war years, that there is a longer-term reasons for why certain people are picked. Because if it was, well, these people had the most collaborators, then the first people that should have been rounded up and deported would have been the Russians, which, of course, is not physically possible.
Right.
Would have been the Ukrainians, right? But so one of the things that actually seems to be a reason is, are these people small enough in numbers that we can punish them in their entirety? Is it logistically possible to round them all up on train cars and remove them to Kazakhstan and Central Asia and Siberia?
You know, maybe that is the answer. It's not so much that they didn't want to do these things en masse as it was simply a practical discussion, right? Like, end result, and again, it's speculating to the nth degree, but end result, we're going to do this with everybody because we're going to plan every facet of life down to, shoelaces, but we have no capability to do this with larger things. So maybe if we can move around the smaller groups like chess pieces, then we can sort of by accident get the bigger groups.
Yeah, but they didn't get all the small groups either. So certain small groups are targeted. They all have certain things in common. So they said one group, kind of general, are groups that are diaspora. So if they have ethnic, historical connections outside of the Soviet Union. So this would be your Koreans, your Germans, your Turks, your Greeks. And the other group, small peoples that didn't come under Russian rule till fairly late, 17th century. They're still independent. So the 18th century is really the first conflicts with the Russian Empire, and really only being subjugated in the 19th century for most of them. And then you have, of course, consistent uprisings, Chechens in particular, against the Tsarist rule and then Soviet rule afterwards. So this would be, the Karachais, the Balkars, the Chechens, the English, and the Kalmuks and the Crimean Tatars. So this kind of makes sense that this is a punishment for past resistance and making sure that the future there will be no more repeat resistance.
And in some cases current. Yeah, that's not unreasonable.
So like the Karbards are not deported. They're during nor are uh, the Adege, who are also Circassian, or the Cherkess. So that group of people between the Karachais and Balkars who are Turkic and deported, and the Chechens and Ingush who are Vainok and deported are left alone. Uh, we don't see deportations of the Dagestani peoples, even though they made up most of the uh, Ostlegion for the North Caucasus for the German Wehrmacht. We don't see deportation of uh, a variety of other smaller groups in the Caucasus, the Ossetians, who are Iranian but mostly Eastern Orthodox. So I think it had to do with which groups have been in opposition historically.
How much of a pain you are. I'm
Right.
going.
Well, and will be in the future. So while
Yeah,
the Circassians were a big pain for Tsarist Russia basically took care of the problem by expelling most of them in the Ottoman Empire, where most of them died on the way or shortly after arriving. So during the Soviet period, they're not a problem.
right.
Whereas the Chechens are still around making trouble.
See, that sort of makes sense again, because they're the a through line of most of the Soviet Union is some sort of paranoia. Um, well, about everything. They get they're very worried about. I guess resistance is the right word.
Yeah.
But it's not just that. Infiltration is the other side of the
Right,
coin.
right. That was the diaspora group. And interesting, the diaspora groups that are left alone in 37 and 38, all of them have one thing in common, that they do not have a historical homeland that they are currently occupying. That is, they are all basically diaspora everywhere. So in 37 and 38, there is no mass operation against the Jews, the Gypsies, or the Assyrians. But none of these people have a homeland the way the Germans, the Poles, the Finns, the Latvians do. So there is no foreign state. And then we see that after Israel is formed in 48, you have things like the Doctor's Plot and uh, going against rootless cosmopolitans. So you do now that they have a state in after 49, they come under a lot more suspicion. Whereas when they didn't, there isn't this idea, that they can hook up with the foreign state the way the Poles and the Germans, because it just doesn't exist yet. So
Right.
I think you can look there as to where they're perceiving these threats coming from. Is there a foreign state they can hook up with, or are they historically uh, been resisting and still capable of it in the future?
See, that goes right along with a lot of other decisions they make, right? Because
Right, and you should also
infiltration things are a big deal for them.
you
Um,
you look at the purges. They purge all the foreign communist parties in Moscow except for one particular group, subgroup. So the Polish Communist Party and the Korean Communist Party are almost completely wiped out and have to be reformed because all their leaders in Moscow are shot in 37 and 38.
yeah. Well,
But there are no Black American communists in Moscow arrested. So this is diaspora group, because there's no Black American state, as the Soviets wanted to
right.
create in the U.S. South, that would be a potential threat. So this is the same thing as the Assyrians, right? There's no Assyrian state, right? So who are these people gonna hook up with to oppose us?
Now that's funny, uh, because that sort of implies that had they gotten their way and gotten a Black American communist state, they would have gone after Black American communists in Russia.
That is very possible, because then you would have had, which never happened, but you would have had then, black would have become, I'm not sure what they would have called it, because Cherny has a different connotation in Russian, but they probably would have just used the word Negro at the time. Would have been an official nationalnost, and it never was. So people that were of African descent, the small population, always had various different descriptors, right? But there was never a single unified one. So if they had become an officially recognized nationalnost, then you can have an official campaign against them based upon that. But if you
Right.
don't have them recognized as an official nationalnost, you can't really target them on that basis
Well,
in a
you
legal
don't.
sense.
Right. This non-specific group of people does not make a good enemy.
Right. So if you look at blacks, people partial, most of them are mixed race, so they have whatever is not African, be Georgian or Abkhazian or Russian or Jewish as their nationalnost. But those that didn't would have something else that was close. Arab was a common nationalnost for people of African descent from the Caucasus, slaves that were brought over from Africa by the Ottomans into Abkhazia. But there wasn't an official, as it were, Negro uh, classification for nationality.
Hmm. Maybe that's the other thing, because I mean, of all the things that you could, all the criticisms there are to lay at the Soviet Union, their group propaganda stuff was good. I mean, in the sense that like it was horrifically terrible, but they were good at it.
Yeah.
That might
So I think that you would have had them go after them. They had an independent black Soviet Social Republic in the Deep South. The black communists from the U.S. in Moscow would have been targeted along with other foreign communists. But because they were considered to be a stateless diaspora, this saves them.
That's interesting, because the sort of that thing that doesn't exist in communism, but definitely does in fascism, where they insist on propagating to other countries. And that, all right, that's an incredibly nerdy and boring joke, but still, that this sort of implies that they're, methodologically speaking, would have created all of these effective nation states and then started deporting everyone to them immediately.
Well, yeah, maybe not immediately, but yeah, that did happen in reality. So in the 1920s, under the bio-Leninism part of Leninism, they create all of these ethno-states, and then under Stalin and the bio-Stalinism part, they start deporting them into Kazakhstan, Central Asia, and Siberia, and abolishing their ethno-states.
Right. That's funny, because that supposedly this is the reason we hate Hitler. I don't know.
Well, I don't think it's exactly parallel. The people that got ethno-states under Hitler were generally not deported in their entirety.
No, not in their entirety. Though, are we just saying that the Soviets were more efficient at this?
Well, it depends on how you define efficiency. I think it's a bit different in that the Soviet Union, the core ethnicity, right? I already alluded to this, but the core ethnicity, the Russians are an imperial nation rather than a nation state, whereas the surrounding peoples, the ones they give ethno-state to, Ukrainians, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Georgians, are nation states. So what you then get is, well, the Imperial Russian core isn't big enough. So we start to see can we add in as related people? So as I said, you kind of like reach the limit of what is related by the time you added Belarusians and Ukrainians. Okay, they're pretty close, and we took care of the Ukrainian problem in 32 and 33 as the Holodomor. We can take some of the Jews who become Russified and assimilated, but once you start hitting up against people like Koreans, there's like no way, no matter how much they acculturate themselves or how loyal they show themselves, that you can really say that they can pass for a Russian, right? They can't change their name and pass
Just
for a Russian the way a assimilated Jew or Belarusian or Ukrainian can.
right. You never get the superficial characteristics to make them blend in. There's no camouflage for being Asian in the middle
Right,
of
right,
Russia.
right. So it's not going to be, well, we're going to ignore, the fact that your grandmother was Jewish and give you a Russian name, right? That's not possible for Koreans.
Right. Huh. Hmm.
So
Never
I
enough time
think
to do
that's where
enough reading.
we get the change. But again, this is kind of circumstantial.
Indeed. Um, all right. I will quit rabbit holing for the moment. Was there somewhere where were we headed next?
Uh, well, perhaps I can sure here get your critical feedback and opinion on my piece from 2016, since it is kind of the core basis of the book I have coming out. So uh, that's kind of where my research has been in the last decade or so.
Give me a minute. So I don't know that I have a whole lot. I mean, I don't know anything that says you're factually wrong, and that would be where any real criticism lies. I guess I should go reread the conclusion for a minute here, make sure I'm not um, not leaving you hanging. Maybe I'll just read it out loud for the sake of not silence on stream. So, conclusion: Soviet citizens of German national Nost suffered horrible persecution at the hands of Stalin regime, or of the Stalin regime during the Second World War. The repercussion was motivated by the distant ancestral ties these people had to the people living in Germany. The Soviet government forcibly deported the ethnic Germans of the USSR to Siberia, Kazakhstan as special settlers, and subsequently mobilized many of them for forced labor, either in the fishing industry, or as members of the labor army. Germans initially escaped this repression by either coming under the protection of the German military or already living in eastern regions of the USSR. Were either coming under or living in the eastern regions of the USSR were later also subjugated to special settlement restrictions and forced labor. The Germans remained under the system of special settlement restrictions and special commandant supervision until the end of 1955, after which they were only partly rehabilitated. They were never allowed to return in large numbers to their former places of settlement. Their autonomous territories were never restored, and they never received any restitution for property lost. So, I mean, I don't know of, I didn't pull out source material and reference any of the dates, but they all, off the top of my head, seem correct. But I mean, I guess the only other things left are things we can't know. So
I did read a criticism from a Russian scholar that I did not talk about the policy of the procurator's office towards the deported Germans, that I only talked about the NKVD.
I'm okay.
So that's one criticism I've noticed of that particular article, but it was by a legal scholar in the Russian Federation whose expertise is the procurator's office. So when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, I guess.
Indeed, but I mean, the NKVD does the majority of all of this, right? They're the ones tasked with it. They have control of the people actually doing it at a ground level. That's who you're talking about. I don't know. Though I guess, to be fair, part of my problem is that reading through this, I am learning things, so it's hard to criticize from that.
Well, I'm going to say that of all of the people I've talked to recently, despite the fact that you don't have a PhD in this subject, you're probably the best read in the existing English language secondary literature I've come across. So far more educated in an autodidactic sense than the vast majority of academics that I encountered in the last 15 years.
Well, thank you. It's it is strange what a passion for the information will do for you.
So that is on your side. If you had learned Russian, you probably could have made a hobby out of being or even attempted a career, although there's very little money in it.
That is a through line of things that I do. Is there's not a lot of money in things that I'm heavily interested in, I find.
No. All right. So that, I guess, would be the final question. Wrap up the legacy of Stalin. I think he's still probably the most important figure of the 20th century, more so than Hitler, who was on the Time magazine of the year twice. But I'd also say that he's still relevant today because really, for socialist state models that can actually take political power and hold it for any length of time, a decade or more. And of course, in the case of the Soviet Union, it was 7 decades, and China will soon be more than that. The model, much more so what Stalin did than what Lenin did, because Lenin is shot and incapacitated and had 3 strokes and dies before they can really get the a system off the ground as far as agricultural collectivization, industrialization, and even unifying the Communist Party as a monolith.
I'm sure every communist in the world would hate for me to say this, but I don't think Lenin could have done it without Stalin. Lenin has I know this is going to be a little bit inaccurate, but Lenin is almost a dreamy artist, whereas Stalin is like the physical embodiment of the hammer and sickle. Right? He's the hard piece that actually gets it done, and that's true for while Lenin's alive. There's a ton of times where Lenin says, "Well, there's a problem over here, and we're just gonna send Stalin, and he'll take care of it." Not to say that Lenin doesn't know what Stalin is doing, at least to some. I mean, I'm sure he doesn't know every minute detail, but when he sends Stalin somewhere, violence occurs, generally repression of whatever the problem is occurs, and then by the time Stalin leaves, someone else can be left in place to kind of take care of whatever Stalin has left standing. And it's, don't get me wrong, it's good politics, as it were, on Lenin's behalf, but I don't think Lenin could have carried the Soviet Union in the same way that Stalin did, or even remotely close. And I don't think it would have been anywhere near what it was without Stalin. Stalin forged a thing that was, even with some general comparatively speaking anyway, weakness that came after him. What Stalin forged was still unimaginably impressive with what they were able to do, even for 40 more years after Stalin dies. And I think if Stalin had had a direct biological heir that he had sort of groomed to be like him, the same way that you see with the Kim family, then I think they would have kept going a lot longer and would have been much further down the line of brutality. But the Soviets were sort of against the idea at the time. So I guess it's not surprising, somewhat convenient that they didn't end up that way.
So, I mean, yeah, I guess the turning point is after Stalin dies, it's Khrushchev who consolidates power, and not Molotov. That's a
Yes.
huge fork in the road. You have this bumbling Ukrainian peasant who is not personality wise at all like Stalin, versus a Molotov who would have in many ways carried on kind of a man of steel tradition. So even the name, these are all fake names, professional wrestling names, but Molotov means man of the hammer and Stalin means man of steel. So they've all got their professional wrestling names. But yeah, I'm going to say that the only person really in modern history, the 20th century, that I think is comparable is Mao, who we discussed.
Yeah.
So none of the other communist leaders, although there's some that are impressive on small scale, like Tito and Castro, they didn't have huge, giant states that could affect things internationally for decades to come. So the Soviet Union is a superpower, and it looks like China is now going to become a superpower. And you can't do that in Cuba. No matter what you do. It's 10 million people.
Right. Well, there are other, and I don't take this as me, minimizing what Castro did, because he was a horrible person as well. But Stalin is a real life, larger than life supervillain, as it were, at least from my point of view of the world. And the things that he was able to accomplish, there's again, because he's one of my favorite source to go for this, is Kotkin talks about somewhere or another he's got a view of the Central Committee, right? And he doesn't expand on this very much, and I wish that he did, but he talks a lot about how even the other people in the Central Committee, in the Politburo, in the top of the Soviet Union, even when they don't like Stalin, they look to him as a guy who is carrying the Soviet Union solely on his back. And Castro doesn't have this. Mao has this for a while, but then he starts establishing a legacy more than carrying everything on his own. And so that's probably part of why China continues on better than the Soviet Union did, is that Mao was more interested in the future than Stalin was in that sense. But the entire time Stalin is alive, everyone knows whether or not
There's
it's
also
true.
not a complete break ever with Mao. So the Stalin is denounced by Khrushchev at the 20th Party Congress.
Yeah.
Whereas the official line of the Chinese Communist Party today is that Mao was 70% right, 30% wrong. So but if I could get somebody to say I'm 70% right, only 30% wrong, that would be great. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I know that feeling. But I think that's because of Mao's actions, right? Mao starts to create a future map so that what has been done can be carried on, and Stalin doesn't. He just, we're plowing through today. There's 5-year plans, but there's not 50-year plans. There's not 500-year plans, right? And Mao does more of that.
Maybe that's part culturally, because the Russians and I'm not so sure specifically about Georgians, but I would assume so. These people think in terms of centuries, and the Chinese think in terms of millennia,
Yeah.
thousands of years, and then Europeans think in terms of decades, and Americans, if we can get
Next
a
five
year, if we
minutes.
get a 1 year,
Yeah.
a 5 year plan, a 5 minute plan, we're on the. That used to be the joke when I was bar hopping in Sacramento. We're on the 5 minute plan. The Politburo has approved the 5 minute plan.
Indeed. I mean, it's accurate, and it probably is very cultural, right? In the sense that Mao was guaranteeably predisposed to this. The various Chinese empires, once they started to establish a length of time, started planning in longer and longer distances. But because of that, you don't see you see Mao looking forward a lot more than you see Stalin looking forward. And so if you're the person after Mao and you say Mao did everything wrong, then all of the plans that exist now must be questioned. But if you're Khrushchev, well, Stalin was yesterday. We're doing new things now, right? And you don't have the ideological ramifications that you would in China, right? You don't have to tear everything down to the ground. Also, partly because mostly what they carried on for a long period of time was Marxist-Leninist principles. Straight through Stalin, it was always Marxist-Leninist, and Lenin didn't have enough of a history, all things considered, to really pick that many bones with him. Does that make sense? We know what I'm talking. Oh,
Yeah.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah, I think you're right with this. But I also think the Soviets could always, point to the pre-Stalin era under Lenin and try and say, well, we've gone back to the real original Leninist principles of the revolution,
Yeah.
and so they could kind of discount Stalin, even though everything that was built in the Soviet Union was built under Stalin. They could just kind of say, well, it was really Lenin, and get rid of some of the things, particularly reform of the legal system, so that you're not arbitrarily arresting millions of people and shooting them, and thereby impeding economic productivity from its already low level due to a variety of other socialist factors. Whereas in China, right, the revolution is led by Mao, so they can't get rid of him completely. They have to have him there as the foundation and base, or the Chinese Communist Party can't explain why it should be in power at all, right? Why shouldn't you go back to the Manchu, the Qing dynasty, or
Right.
reinvite the Kuomintang back from Taiwan, right? Why why are you in power? So they couldn't repudiate him all, but at the same time, then this gives it more flexibility because they're able to say, well, Mao did this good and he did this bad, and we're going to do this good in the future. And so they don't have the fragility that basically ended the Soviet Union, where
Yeah.
there was no flexibility in the system ultimately.
Well, that and I think it's Gorbachev said there at the end, the Chernobyl happened. Now, don't get me wrong, that's invariably him just blaming something other than himself. But large catastrophes do cause.
Yeah, but the catastrophe was the problem because the system was not flexible, because
Oh, yeah.
it was unable to make any changes without fracturing and disintegrating into numerous pieces. So, had they had flexibility, right, the system might have survived. But that flexibility ended in 1964 when Brezhnev came to power after they threw Khrushchev onto his dacha and said, "Okay, that's it for reforms." Right. So up until from 1964 to '86, there's no more reforming of the Soviet Union. You're stuck in this period of time where there's some reforms in the late '50s and early '60s, and then no more. And they call it, in fact, the Zastoy, or the era of stagnation.
I mean, it seems like an accurate term. You know what's funny about that, though, is that the Koreans, specifically the Kim family, moved to a more maternal as opposed to paternal leadership. Right? They're much more motherly than fatherly. There's a lot less.
We're gonna have the first woman communist dictator soon.
We might. You know, what's her broad is his sister or whatever it is that's left.
Yes, his sister, the one all the Wignats say they'll make the exception on race mixing for.
Yeah, that one. But the thing about this is that it sort of provides an inherent flexibility, right? You no longer have strong man, unflinchable leadership. You have mom that would give you the extra cookie after dinner, right? And or whatever it is that you associate with mom being a little bit
cookie
weaker.
Sounds better than gulag.
I mean, it does, right? But you get a more inherent flexibility with the somewhat more feminized leadership that way, or at least if that's what your propaganda is. And there's a guy. The guy is a nut, but his research seems pretty good, and he does a lot of talking about Korea and how they are. All of the Kim family propaganda is about
who is this nut?
What is this guy's name?
Is he a professor somewhere?
He is.
Bruce Cummings? Maybe?
Give me just a second, because someone DM'd this to me a while back, so I will just go grab the DM. My skill with names continues, so... but he is where'd it go? B.R. Myers.
The name doesn't ring a bell. But,
it didn't for me either when I got it sent to me, but he has a ton of he goes over a lot of Korean propaganda, and it's all the Kim family is putting the Koreans to bed. He's the whoever the leadership is doing small things that are caring for people. Whereas if you go look at Stalin is up late. All of the propaganda about Stalin is up late at night burning the midnight oil.
So he was really.
He really was. That is not propaganda. The man didn't sleep, and when he slept on a stove.
Well, that's traditional in Russia. Lots of people sleep on stoves, so that's not a big deal.
Yeah, but the difference here in how they portray the leadership, if
this cult of masculinity was a big thing, particularly in the Stalin era of the 30s and 40s. This idea of the Soviet man is a manly man who works in the factory or the farm and has big muscles, and he is not a soy boy. That is I don't even know how that became part of socialist aesthetics and thought, given how in the 30s and 40s such a cult of masculinity in the USSR. The idea of the soy. No, the proletariat cannot be a bunch of pussies.
Well, so I think Korea is sort of the answer, right? And if you want to get really, really cynical,
so we're gonna have the K-pop androgynous boy bands move from South Korea to North Korea.
Yeah.
That shocked me when I was in Korea. because I'm an old 20th century guy. So my idea of Korean masculinity was the Korean Rock, the Korean Marine who fought in Vietnam in the Tiger Battalion. We're basically talking like, the jacked Asian guy who's like, okay, tell me where the Vietnamese are and I'll kill them. Well, we only kill the North Vietnamese. No, 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 no. That I can't tell you between North and South Vietnamese. Which Vietnamese? Where are the Vietnamese you want me to kill? Which direction?
Just
I'll
point me this
smell the fish sauce on them and kill them all. Right? That
Exactly.
was my idea of like a Korean man. And I get to South Korea, and there's all these big bulletin boards and advertisements for these like very feminine Korean boy bands, and I'm like, Korean women think this is attractive. This is what Korean women think a man should be.
And it's wild, but yes. I mean, because they're, I don't know. It's there's a. I will say that Myers has a fairly interesting speech on this, and he talks about Korea thinks they're better people because they're Korean, and that basically they suffer
That's
the
true.
yoke of hardship that is other countries, right?
Japan. The other country is Japan.
Well, so in North Korea, it's not just Japan anymore. In South Korea, there's still a lot of like, F you, Japan. But the North Koreans are like this with everybody that is not Korean. And they go out of their way about it. Is, we are the better, the pure, the good people. And so our leadership, lacking a better term, needs to coddle us because we are the better and good people. And it's an interesting thing, and sort of might explain why it is that the Koreans don't deal with a lot of the uprising problems that the Soviets did, for example. Because,
well, for one thing, there's no ethnic heterogeneity. Everybody's Korean.
Yeah, that helps. It certainly, you don't have any of those problems to deal with, but even the born and bred Russians were not always particularly happy with the Soviet Union. They dealt with it in very Russian ways, but the Koreans don't seem to have this problem in quite the same way.
Yeah, there's also, I think, even their homogeneity, though. So one of the things interesting about Korea is that, unlike the Soviet Union and China, there isn't a huge amount of violence to engage in land reform. So in the Soviet Union, we talk about the dekulakization, with 1.8 million people sent to the Arctic and the Urals, and in China, there's the land reform campaign in the late 40s, early 50s. About 2 million people were shot. But in Korea, the Korean War, all the landlords flee to the south. So they flee North Korea into South Korea. So the landlord class like voluntarily leaves or flees what becomes the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Well, they are not forcibly loaded onto cattle cars the way they are in the Soviet Union. And so when they do the land reform and collectivization, there isn't this group of people from the past, supposedly former peoples, to use the Soviet term, that they need to kill or dispossess, because they are across the 38th parallel in the Republic of Korea.
Yeah.
So you had this class homogenization occur as a result of the war.
Well, this also is probably heavily contributory to why North Korea does not have gulags in the same way that the Soviet Union did, right?
They have labor camps, though.
They do, but as far like, if you are talking the Soviet Union, you're talking gulags. You just are, right? They're a very big part of it. It was a very big linchpin of a lot of things that the Soviets did. The Koreans don't seem to need to do that quite the same way, right? Like
they don't. I think there was a period of time when Kim Il-sung was still alive, where there was a large, we're talking obviously not millions of people because North Korea is small, but hundreds of thousands of people sent to forced labor camps in North Korea. So between 1953 and I would say all the way up into the 1980s, there was
Yeah,
still this, until Kim Il sung dies and his son Kim Jong il comes to power. Uh, Forced labor was a big part of the legal punitive security system of the North Korean state.
definitely. But when Kim Il Sung is dying, dead, whatever, right immediately there where Kim Jong Il takes power, there's a very big shift where no longer is there a lot of military discussion to be had, but there is a lot of economic discussion to be had. Not to say that the North Koreans don't still have a giant
Right,
military.
because they have serious economic problems with the Soviet Union collapses and the Chinese say, we're getting tired of you sucking on our tit.
Yeah. And so the leadership changes quite a bit, but even before Kim Jong-un takes over, Kim Il-sung is still softer than Stalin, right? I mean, don't get me, everybody's softer than Stalin, but even then they were always they were softer than Mao. They were a little bit softer all the way along, and when Kim Jong-un takes over, he sort of just plows right into that softness. And so most of the he stops labor camping people anywhere near as hard. The numbers go down dramatically, and his leadership style, as it were, is much more effeminate than even his father, who was, again, I don't know if you want to say he was more effeminate than Mao, but he was less stringent. And so,
yeah, I would say that whole generation. So Stalin, Mao, Kim Il Sung. This is much more masculine than Kim Jong Il or Kim Jong Un or uh,
indeed,
uh, soy boy communist in Seattle and Portland, where
yes,
where Stalin is looking down or up from Stalin is looking up from hell and screaming,
yes.
"This
What are
is
you
the worst
doing?
torture. What have you done to my movement?"
Right. But the thing is, the North Koreans are much more pacified than everybody else's leadership, right? Everybody else's regimes. The
This is true. How much does this have to do with the fact that the leadership and how much it had to do with they're just Korean? So the kind of a cultural factor that China and the Russian Empire, these have always been infinitely more heterogeneous and chaotic and less orderly than the Hermit Kingdom.
some for sure, right? But if you want to engage with some raw cynicism with me for a moment here, Korea is still North Korea. The DPRK is
Which I've
still
never been to. I've only been to the ROK.
shocking, really. Being
I
being the
had
giant tourist
I
trap
had
that
a
they are.
office mate in Iraqi Kurdistan. She had been to the DPRK. She was an American, but she had never
Really?
been to the ROK.
Huh. That's a rarity.
It was very strange and bizarre. She
uh,
said that one of the weirdest thing is like they set up like a fake bar with like fake people in it who like spoke fluent English, or like the very few tourists there. Like it wasn't like a real bar. They like literally set up a place that the natives couldn't enter, and everybody there, including the quote patrons, right, were working to create this Potemkin bar, and they all spoke perfect English, right? And of course, there's no shortages of anything at this particular. Very bizarre.
shocking, right? Uh,
What?
well, this is so engage with my cynicism for a moment because I am more than a little worried about this. The Chinese still have a lot of influence in North Korea, and they seem to be trying to export the North Korean model to everybody not China. And so
Ah,
I I am starting to wonder if they had heavy influence on Kim Jong-il, which is not, I mean, I think we know
Well,
they did.
historically, before the Japanese took Korea as a protectorate in 1905, Korea was a long-time vassal state of China.
Right. So I mean, there's great precedent for this, but there's also very obvious political lines where it's happening now. But if you go look at the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, or One Road, or whatever they're calling it today, it's the same sort of thing where they go in to try and make life better for some other group of people, and then the leadership that they leave is not particularly hard in the place where they leave leadership, where they're not still in direct control. The leadership they leave is somewhat soft and very pliant to whatever the Chinese whims are, which is not a surprise. And so I'm starting to wonder if that is really what we're dealing with, is that the Chinese are trying to create a pliant globe that is communistic, that they can then come over and exert their will over, because it sounds like a Chinese thing to do.
Well, maybe. I mean, that's something like out of Hawaii Five-O.
A little bit.
There was a lot of kind of like discussion of that in the early 50s, particularly when you got the first reports of returning POWs from Chinese captivity in the Korean War, of the kind of brainwashing programs, what they were at. But I couldn't say because I don't have access to that information, but it certainly sounds fascinating if they create a bunch of soy boys that are easy to manipulate and control while still maintaining some of the old Maoist masculinity in China itself.
Yeah.
So,
There's weird little things that make me think this might be true. Like all of
like
these
the fact
places.
that the younger Kims don't smoke, the older ones did.
Yeah. But on top of that, there's really weird stuff that seems to sort of parallel this idea. Like the Chinese buy land anywhere that they possibly can, right? Outside of China. They buy a lot less in China, but outside of China, the Canadians have been dealing with Chinese buying land there and it causing problems.
They buy a lot in Africa.
Yeah. But here in the United States, it's all on the coastline. You could buy a ton of land that will never change in price in the Midwest, or will only change in price based on inflation, right? The value of that land is pretty set, minus whatever improvements you do to it. And since what they're doing is buying stuff and leaving it alone, that seems like a better place to do that if you were looking. And prior theory on the subject is that, there are a lot of people there looking for what amounts to a bank outside of China. So if you buy American land, then you don't have to worry about what the Chinese do because they can't really take it. And if you leave China, then you still have money. Well, if what you're doing is creating this little soy-filled hell to exert control over, then that's where you buy the land, right? You don't buy it in Wyoming, even though Wyoming property is going to stay equivalent in value to Wyoming property.
There's also is the fact that if you want to buy cheap farmland, Africa is a much better deal. So in Africa, they do buy farmland that's inland, use for growing of food. And I'm not sure because I lived in West Africa for about 5.5 years. It's not like the stereotype of Africans being super masculine compared to white people, right? But I can also see, your traditional African isn't going for this soy boy shit either with the boy band.
Yeah. They do not seem fond of that. And so if my off the wall, checked against almost nothing thesis here is correct, it will be interesting to watch what they do in Africa over the next 20 or 30 years. Because if that's what they're doing, then Africa should get a lot more pacified over that time frame. Unless, I don't know, we go to World War III and try to stop the Chinese. But in the interim, it should be interesting to watch.
Yeah, so the Chinese want to turn all of their potential enemies into soy boys, so that I guess that they can't physically fight against the Chinese army. The People's Liberation Army will be the last men around the world.
I mean, if they're not actively doing it, it's certainly happening passively. You know, at the same time that we are talking about diversifying, we need more women in special forces. The Chinese are over there going, okay, so what we're going to do is we're just going to beat you for a while and have you lift more weights. You know, so it is happening regardless.
Yeah, I suppose it is, but I don't think totally immune to it, because I would say that it's because China was more masculine under Mao because of the Stalinist legacy, that was like a crucial pillar, and that having opened up somewhat to capitalism, they haven't been able to maintain it to the same degree. That you do get this erasure of this kind of socialist archetype of masculinity that develops in the Soviet Union, and then other communists adopt. But as you say, the North Koreans, we're a long way from Kim Il Sung now, and of course, so maybe even the hardcore Maoist, the guys that smoking chain smoking cigarettes and talking about having gone on the long walk and fought in Korea and against Vietnam and the short war, etc. Well, these guys are getting really old, and they're going to die off eventually. So, Deng Xiaoping himself eventually died. I don't know, he was pretty old when he died, but right. So that whole generation is going to go. So there's not going to be any of these, hardened PLA types that have a combat experience left soon.
I get the feeling that they are working on a new generation of that, though, right? Because China's getting into weird little skirmishes all over the place. No full-scale war things yet, but they are getting into what amounts to a pushing match between countries, right? Every couple of weeks they have 50 rounds fired on their border with India. It's nothing.
Yeah, but that goes back to the early 60s.
Yeah. But they wax and wane in how often they're doing it, and they are definitely waxing at the moment, right? There is definitively more of them now than there were 5 years ago. Now that could be for a billion different reasons, but it is still happening.
You would almost, though, I think, have to revive what they called the Third Front, where they sent out all these guys to Xinjiang and Manchuria, to develop oil and mining and these other hard physical labor. So, your guy would go out in from the Chinese army to be an oil worker out in the middle of nowhere, right? Literally, you set up your tent to live in it, find a source of water, and start getting oil out of the ground and into this pipeline for us. Right? And those guys, by necessity, are pretty manly, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, they don't hack it.
Right. You figure it out or you die. Though on that front, there's some of that with them, and don't get me wrong, it's nowhere near as hard as the old Chinese oil was, but there's some of that with rare earth metals that's going on, because they have real serious health problems that come with not giving a damn about anybody's safety and processing rare earth metals. So you're getting a similar but not the same scenario.
Yeah. But I mean, they used to have these little stories about these guys. They're basically, modern Chinese Paul Bunyans,
Yeah.
and they were all Red Army guys that had gone out and done this, what they called the Third Front, which is to develop these, frontier regions of China. It was very expensive, like 3 times as more expensive than to develop the core, but they wanted to build up the areas on the Soviet border for strategic reasons. But yeah, the kind of heroes of these the stories were definitely pretty masculine. Hello?
I have no idea what happened there.
You froze up. I'm not sure why.
I think my internet connection dropped for a moment there, so I think I was right about it, Paul Bunyan's.
Yeah. So yeah, I said there's a lot of similarity. The 1950s and 1960s talking about these guys. They're all Chinese PLA members that go out in the Third Front to develop frontier regions in the oil or other heavy labor to try and develop the frontier there. So that was the image for a long time in China. That this is what a man is, right? Not the soy boy band.
I wonder, because the Chinese seem really good at assimilating outside ideas that they think are worthwhile, and that was still a thing that we were celebrating at the time.
Right, there's an American version of it, and part of the American version is socialistic. Jack London, in particular, a socialist writer who had this kind of version of masculinity that you see with the communists in the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, and then of course then being adapted into China under Mao. So it was a thing at the time, and of course there's a whole fascist version of it in Italy and a National Socialist version of it in Germany in the middle 20th century. So oftentimes you get like a piece of artwork from the New Deal, from National Socialist Germany, and from the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and they'd all look exactly the same.
Yes. And even it was the art style of the time, but still, that's a thing that bothers the hell out of me for a whole bunch of reasons. But will we ever learn? No. On the other hand, though, in the world of somewhat convenient timing, I guess, of kicking me out of the stream, we have just crossed 3 hours, which I would not have known if there wasn't a timer.
So, oh, that's good. Yeah, so thank you very much for coming on.
Oh, thank you. I enjoy these. These are good. I've been looking forward to this since we started talking about it.
All right, and hopefully some people will come in and watch it since this is not my normal time, so it won't just be the people that saw us live. But thank you very much. Appreciate you coming on to talk to me. Again, it's not easy even in academia to find people well read on the subject. So when I do, it's a pleasure to talk to them.
I know that feeling, right? 90% of the people that I ever talk to about the Soviet Union is it was a good idea with bad leadership, and it's the it was a horrible idea with incredible leadership.
Yeah, that's basically as a horrible idea with evil genius leadership.
Indeed, I like nothing about Stalin, but the man is worth respecting for the things that he could get done. He was. It's difficult to know where to start with people who have not done any research on the subject.
No, I think there's a lot of propaganda. One of the things which I'm glad is finally dispelled was Deutscher, who was a Trotskyite, kind of put it in the heads of everybody that Stalin was kind of an idiot and was not well read and was not a theoretician of socialism. And that
Yeah.
was just all sour grape because Trotsky got the pickaxe in his head.
Yeah. You get a lot of Stalin was an idiot brute haphazardly doing whatever came to his mind.
That's not true at all, it turns out.
No, yeah, no, he was a very calculating human being, and very, very good at what he did, which, to be fair, was do horrible stuff, but he was good at it. So, it's funny how much Trotsky and the legacy of him and his little family, I guess, of acolytes have guided.
In this case, in particular, Isaac Deutscher,
Yeah,
whose depiction of Stalin as being an idiot is very far from the truth.
Yeah. I don't know. It's hard. It's probably why I enjoy talking to you so much. At least.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on, and hopefully I'll see you sometime in the future.
Oh, you definitely
talk about
will.
something probably related, since I don't like internet drama, which unfortunately I think taken up too much of your time recently. I have avoided it.
I don't blame you. I'm doing what I can to turn that into an intellectual discussion and skip the drama part.
Well, good luck. I'm just avoiding it completely. So thank you very much, and I'll see you later.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. All right, everybody. Thank you for showing up in the chat. I'll see everybody next week.